As a general ethos, I think it's super useful to aim your sights at performance. So we're going to try everything we do today, we are going to measure to the metric of performance rather than necessarily pain or dysfunction or discomfort. We might use these words intermittently as we go along, but know that at the heart of it, what we really want to talk about, what we really want to aim for is improving performance. So I'm going to share the slides with you now. So apologies again for the Fix Your Shoulder moniker of today's webinar. So what we are going to cover is, first off, what is a shoulder, right? Like, what constitutes a shoulder joint or a shoulder region, and what does so in a way that we can use in a workable model. So we're going to go through the bones and joints. We're going to talk about the muscles and tendons, and then we're going to help build your own model of how to manage shoulder performance. And again, we'll really harp on that. If you catch me slipping and starting to just talk about, the shoulder in general, just call me out on it, or shoulder pain or shoulder dysfunction, just call me out on it, because I do really want to focus inside the realm of performance, right? So that's really what I want to gear our efforts towards today. So when we deal with the shoulder, now I pulled this definition straight from a PubMed study about shoulder anatomy, and it's overly simplified. So if those of you guys following along at home, the shoulder joint connects the upper arm to the shoulder blade. This is where the round head of the upper arm bone, head of the humerus, rests in the shoulder socket, the glenoid, at the side of the shoulder blade. And it's like, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. And look, there's a certain utility in having a very, very simplistic view. However, the second you have a problem, right, you're going to need a slightly more detailed model. So the goal of today is going to be able to create a high resolution, big picture of the shoulder. And for those of you who might be familiar with pixels and resolution and images, the bigger the picture, physically, the bigger the picture, the higher resolution it's going to have to be. If you just take a small picture and blow it up, it gets really pixelated, it gets hard to see, it gets all distorted. And that's, I think, the problem with people who don't flesh out and really think through their processes before they go train, is they take this very small, very low resolution understanding, and they go to blow it up, and it gets a little bit pixelated at the level of application. So we're going to expand on this a bit, because it's not wrong, right? Like, this is not necessarily a wrong way of looking at the shoulder. It's just incomplete, right? So when we look at the shoulder and we're looking at the bones and joints, we got to understand that the shoulder is really more of a region than a joint. Most people, like the definition sort of alluded to, most people think of the shoulder as just the ball and socket joint, right? It's a terminology we hear a lot. If you've gotten a little bit more sophisticated approach, you might have someone refer to it as like a golf ball in a tee, which kind of all that golf ball in a tee analogy is trying to relay is that the socket of the shoulder is not as deep as the socket analogy might make you believe, where a golf ball and a tee really sort of encapsulates, pun intended, how much overlapping surface area the socket actually has on the head of the humerus, which compared to our hip, which is more of a true ball and socket joint, which has more of that encapsulation, shoulder has far less. So we call it a ball and socket joint to keep it simple, but it's not a structural analog to a ball and socket. It's not as if you're going to attach your trailer hitch to a trailer to the back of your truck on a hitch. It's not that level of encapsulation, right? So it's quite shallow. And in that lack of depth, let's say, carries with it the ability to have a lot of freedom of movement, right? I can do this, put my arm over my head, as a consequence of that shallow encapsulation. But with that also comes, a lot of room for compensation, a lot of rooms for potential quote unquote problems. So that's going to be where we kind of really set our sights on today, is how can we, maximize the performance while mitigating and minimizing some of the risks. So when we look at the bones and joints of the shoulder, the bones, we're obviously going to talk about the humerus or the arm bone, scapula or shoulder blade. We're going to talk about the clavicle or collarbone. We're going to talk about the sternum. We're also going to talk about the rib cage as well, right? All of these are going to interplay to make really more globally the region of the shoulder. And when we go to create an intervention to help improve the performance of things acting at and through the shoulder, we're going to start to incorporate all of these different bones and all of these different joints. So when we look at the joints of the shoulder, we're going to be looking at 4 primarily. Now, if you wanted to get into the weeds, I know there's a physical therapist here. If anyone's into orthopedics or anatomy or any general surgeons, you can probably pick out 1 or 2 more specific landmarks in this. But if we deal in the general realm of health and fitness, this is a really good place to start in understanding shoulder anatomy as so far as it intersects with our ability to train physical properties at the shoulder, right? I don't hope, but like, as long as you're not cutting people for a living, this is a really high resolution starting point to understand the interplay between different joints of the shoulder. So glenohumeral joint, as the name suggests, and as we sort of already iterated a few times, glenohumeral, glenoid, socket, humerus, arm bone. This is the ball and socket joint of the shoulder, right? Now, this is where the majority of movement happens at the shoulder, right? So me going into abduction or flexion or internal and external rotation, most people assume that that's the only place that movement happens at the shoulder, which is incorrect, right? Movement is ever present, albeit really minimal in some places, but very important still. And, you know, a lot and a ton of range of motion at the glenohumeral joint, but the interplay of all the motion everywhere is going to be what makes a quote unquote functioning or high performing shoulder. So you need to have, as a general rule, the more joints you have, the more movement you should have, right? And that's a heuristic that you can take with you anywhere around the body, right? Like my foot, for example, my foot has a ton of bones and has a ton of joints. And as a byproduct, should have a ton of movement. Now, commonly what happens is people start to lose mobility in their foot. A spine is another example, right? A spine has a ton of joints. We have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. You know, we have a sacrum, a coccyx, an SI joint. And you know, we have articulating ribs through the 12 thoracic vertebra. All of those joints require a certain amount of movement. So globally, we should see a ton of movement at the spine. Right? A lot of times we're taught to purposely immobilize and stiffen our spine, where a better approach, a more pragmatic approach for living human beings is probably to move that spine a little bit more. Same is going to be the case for the shoulder. So we have glenohumeral joint, ball and socket, pretty straightforward. That's sort of the conceptual starting point for most people when it comes to shoulder anatomy. Next is acromioclavicular. So AC joint is where the clavicle, right? So the collarbone meets the spine of the scapula, right? So acromio is basically, if we see here, the acromion is the point on the top of the shoulder. So I can't really see it good on me. I went to college with a kid who had like little points sitting up right here. So you guys pay attention to where my pencil is. This is sort of where the spine of the scapula wraps around from the shoulder blade and then articulates with the clavicle. So basically the AC joint, if we had to put it in like layman's terms, it's the joint between the collarbone and the shoulder blade. And that can kind of be tough to conceptualize because we think of the shoulder blade as just existing on the back, and we think of the collarbone just existing on the front. But they kind of come together and intersect at this point of the shoulder, which makes the AC joint. Now, there is far less movement at the AC joint than at the glenohumeral joint. And it's one of the regions where if we start to see an increase or decrease in movement, it's very problematic. If any of you are familiar with lower body anatomy, I would almost make the comparison that the AC joint, right, so where the acromion meets the clavicle, is similar in its structure function relationship, which means how the intersection of the bones and the muscles and the soft tissues interact with one another. It's the upper body analog, I would say, to the SI joint. Right. So people might have SI joint dysfunction. They think they have low back issues. They reach towards their lumbar spine like, ow, ow, I have a lumbar spine disc herniation. A lot of times it actually turns out just being an issue with this really finicky joint between your pelvis and your sacrum that has a little bit of movement. And if it has too much, it's a problem. And if it has too little, and it's also a problem. That's kind of like the AC joint. So the AC joint isn't meant to move, isn't made to move that much. It's meant to let the clavicle rotate. So if I go put my arm over my head, my clavicle, my collarbone on this side has to rotate upwards to allow my scapula to move with it so that I can get my arm over my head, right? So minimal amount of movement at the AC joint, but very important amount of movement at the AC joint. And a lot of times limitations at AC joint movement, if we look at like in the weight room, especially this day and age, when the sternum drops, are like, let's say I'm reaching overhead or I'm doing some lat variation movement. If my sternum is down, right, and I'm hunching over like this, I know that my clavicles are not going to be rotating well, right? So I think about, getting a tall spine position, and I think of the reference point of the sternum often, because this is going to tell me, is my clavicle in a proper position so that it can rotate to contribute to that overall movement of the shoulder, right? So the clavicle is going to rotate. AC joint doesn't have a ton of movement, but the movement it requires is very important. And we can run into problems when we don't have it, or when we don't give ourselves access to it. That's another way to look at it. When we don't have our access to that range of motion, right? So we have ball and socket joint of the glenohumeral joint, or ball and socket of the glenohumeral joint, the acromioclavicular joint, which is sort of out that attaches the scapula to the clavicle. And think of that. It's really important when we're triaging exercise. I want you to put a mental pin in that point as we go and talk about how we're going to move into our next training week and start to improve shoulder function. The AC joint is the joint between the shoulder blade and the clavicle, right? Key, kind of put a pin in that. Sternoclavicular joint, we won't belabor for too long. Sternoclavicular joint is in the midline of the body, right? So it's where the sternum meets the clavicle, or the clavicle meets the sternum. This is a very, very rigid joint. We don't get a ton of movement here, if any. Now, it's a general principle that we see in joints that are located right in the middle of the body. So there's really two that we could classify here. The first being the sternoclavicular joint, right, where our two clavicles come in and attach just on this little notch here at the top of the sternum, right under our trachea. And the other joint that's very similar in structure function relationship is at the joint of our pelvis, right? So where our two innominate bones come together to form our pubic symphysis, that's a very rigid joint as well. So these joints do not like to move. Midline joints of the body, these two really like to stay pretty rigid. So you might, if someone is experiencing symptoms, again, we're going to be pretty careful with the pain diagnosis word, but that might just be a light on the dashboard that says, hey, check the engine, right? It might not be something that there's necessarily an issue here, because this could mean that there's a whole bunch of other stuff not moving, where this not tiny, but it's relatively small compared to the rest of them. This very small, relatively rigid joint, if we start to experience symptoms here, we're likely that's just light on the dashboard. And if anyone's ever owned a Ford truck, like I did 3 times before I finally learned my mistake, you just don't put the tape over the light on the dashboard. You run the code, you fix it, and that becomes your solution. Is always elsewhere. It's not that light on the dashboard. So lastly, we're going to talk about the scapulothoracic joint. Very important, very, I don't want to say misunderstood, but it's something where, we need to understand the pseudo joint, because it is sort of a pseudo joint in the idea that it's really what we're referring to is the articulation of the shoulder blade with the rib cage. Now, in some ways, it has properties of a normal joint. In some ways, it's a little bit unique. So it's the entire undersurface or ventral surface of the shoulder blade with the dorsal aspect of the rib cage, right? And how those two articulating surfaces are going to glide. There is a ton of movement here. It's actually usually makes up for around 1/3 of overall movement. So if I put my arm over my head, right? Actually, I think if we go back to this slide here, this is a pretty good representation, visual representation of how the shoulder blade actually contributes to overall movement, right? So once this arm gets fully overhead, the scapula will have accommodated for about 60 of this 180 degrees of motion. Now, that's 1/3 if we do the math. There's some nuance to that. So I don't want you leaving here today thinking that for every 2 degrees the arm moves, the shoulder blade moves 1 degree, right? That's an incorrect way of thinking about it. And this is where, as we build a higher and higher resolution working model of the shoulder region, things like this become drastically important to help make better decisions faster, right? So when people see a diagram like what's on the screen here and they go, oh, 60, 120, 180, I can do a bit of rudimentary math. If the shoulder blade contributes 60 degrees to this 180 degrees, That's 1/3, which leaves the glenohumeral joint taking the additional 2/3, which ipso facto carry the 1, do some biomechanics math. Therefore, every 2 degrees the arm moves, the shoulder blade assists 1 degree. That's incorrect. There's timing is everything when it comes to shoulder motion. When things move is as important as what is moving, right? So we're going to put a pin in that as well. We'll return back to that as we move through the hour. And seeing as it's 20 minutes in, we're probably going to be longer than an hour. So that's bones and joints, right? So we're pretty good. Sternum, clavicle, scapula, humerus, ribs, T-spine, structures, acromioclavicular joint, glenohumeral joint, scapulothoracic joint, sternoclavicular joint. Good. Should hopefully have at least heard these words for the first time. And look, like I'm talking to an attendee list of 96 people right now, and there's a couple thousand who signed up. So all of you are going to be coming in with a different experience, with different familiarities with these words. If some of you, it's your first time hearing this, it's okay as long as it's not your last, right? We're just going to, if you have questions, my email is jordan@themuscledoc.com. Feel free to email me. I will stay on after and I will answer questions as long as I need to. But just, I want to talk to the advanced crowd that might look to get something out of this, but I also want to talk to people who might be seeing this for the first time, right? Are those degrees independent, right? Okay, we'll get to that. That's a really good question. So when we get into the muscles now, I'm going to deliberately break these down into 3 separate components. And we're going to explain why as we move through this. So when we talk about muscles and tendon at the shoulder, serratus anterior, rhomboids, traps, and levator. So serratus anterior, rhomboids, traps, and levator. I'm going to break bad here on this screen share. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to the whiteboard because I think it's super useful, even if you are a relative novice with this, to understand the relationship between. Okay, great. Anyone in the chat box, just want to confirm that you can see a blank whiteboard that I am currently drawing a little tree at the bottom of. Okay, everyone, great. Bob Ross, shout out. We're going to put a little tree down there. It's going to be our little secret. Mr. 10K, good to see you, brother. Hope Australia's treating you well. Okay, so it's worth understanding in a little bit more detail as we discuss these muscles, right? So when we see serratus, rhomboid, trap, and levator, you guys should be able to see what is the similar vein that ties these muscles together. Patty Roach, oh bless, hey, happy belated Patty Roach. Hope you're doing well. Timeless Patty Roach. Okay, so when we look at the shoulder blade, right, I've drawn a few of these in my day. I'm going to make it a little bit thicker. All right, so we're going to do this. It's worth understanding in a little bit higher dimension how the shoulder blade actually moves. And when we're looking at the muscles that we just discussed, rhomboid, serratus anterior, levator, and the traps, we need to realize that what makes these worthy of being in the same list, the common vein that ties these together, is that they all act on the shoulder blade, right? Now, when we think of the shoulder blade, we oftentimes think of the shoulder blade as like playing bone Tetris, right? Like it's just kind of protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. It's like, slightly more complicated than that, right? Like if I go into my notebook here, I'm going to try and anthropomorphize this for you outside of my little drawing. I'm going to rip a page out or 100 pages out, depending. All right, I'm going to make some origami for you. Shoulder blades, like most joints in your body or like most landmarks in the body, have what's called an instantaneous axis of rotation, which means it has access to all 3 planes of motion simultaneously. And we only say one of the planes of motion because it makes our lives easier. So for example, talked about a brief comparison between the innominate bone and the scapula, talking about the SC joint, the AC joint and the SI joint. Yeah, it's pretty good. Not my best work. I'll turn this into a fucking origami swan after this. All right, so what I want you to think of, this is a shoulder blade, right? Now, protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. That is not how the series of muscles that I just put up on the screen, that's not how they allow this shoulder blade to move, right? So this shoulder blade will move, and I'm putting this hole in very strategically. will move through what's called an instantaneous axis of rotation, which works out to be right about where my pencil is. So we're going to get not only abduction and adduction of the shoulder blade, which a lot of people call like retraction and protraction. We're also not going to get elevation and depression. We're also going to get a tilting. So this instantaneous axis of rotation allows this relatively concave dorsal aspect of the shoulder blade to sit into a relatively convex ventral aspect, reverse that, ventral dorsal, into this sort of big spoon, little spoon with the rib cage. And we can't actually move into elevation or depression or protraction or retraction without moving through all three planes at once. That is so unbelievably crucial a concept to understand, because we think we're like, oh, I'm flexing my shoulder blade is tilting forward too much. It's like, well, it's not just doing that. It's also moving through two other planes too much. So when we look at this very like two-dimensional model, you have to realize that I might start this from scratch as I've done this too large. So when you look at a scapula, you need to understand sort of the interplay of the muscles that act on it, right? And this is going to be a useful starting point, because if we don't kind of overthink our approach at this level, we're going to be really left chasing our tail. And it's worth taking an hour out of your Friday, or if you're Patty Roach and Jason Tenkate, enjoying the beautiful weather in North Sydney beaches, your Saturday morning, then you're going to get in the gym and you end up wasting a ton of fucking time. So just take the hour, work on building a framework or a heuristic so that when you're in the gym, you can make really simple, fast decisions that are super valuable and super accurate. So if we think of the rhomboids, just really quickly, rhomboids are going to go to the lower cervical spine and to the T5 thoracic vertebra. So if you're trying to landmark this on the body, and this is, take away some of these small one-liners. Where is the T5 vertebra in a body? Let's think about this. Well, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and goes in this nice, hopefully a nice sweeping arc, right, that we call a kyphosis. If this arc has 12 vertebrae, which is going to be the apex of the curve, right? Like if I do this and I draw an arc like that, this is the apex. Well, let's say this arc was made up of 12 different segments. That would be the sixth vertebra. So where is the bottom of someone's rhomboid? Probably just above the apex of the arc of where their thoracic kyphosis is, right? So that's just really quick. You'll find that coming in handy so often, like especially as you start to learn more about lat anatomy and understand that the lats actually insert at T6. Right. So in lats insert T6 to 212, L1 to L5, it's like, oh, now I know exactly how to landmark the lat, because I know logically that the apex of a thoracic curve is the sixth thoracic vertebra. Right. So just getting good at this and practicing this. And when you're with your clients or when you're training, understand what you're looking at. Like the goal in understanding anatomy is to really like look at someone with like Iron Man X-ray vision glasses on. And like, I'm basically blind. So these are kind of X-ray vision. I have the worst eyes on the planet. Actually so bad, I got a ticket for not wearing, I won't pay this. This is a ticket from the Mississauga Police Department for not wearing glasses while I was driving. Can't make this shit up. I had contacts in, but he didn't want to hear it. Anyways, if anyone works in Mississauga PD and wants to get rid of that for me, you let me know. So T5 rhomboids are going to go up towards, are going to go from the midline border of the scapula up. Now, what we have here is we have the traps now starting from kind of the spine of the scapula that go up towards the cervical spine. Actually, let's color code this. Let's make this fun, shall we? All right, so let's make the traps purple. So traps are going to go from the spine of the scap, kind of where the acromion process is, and they're going to have some horizontal fibers that are going to come up, and they're going to have some, horizontal fibers that go across. And then we're going to have mid fibers that go straight across, and we're going to have these low fibers that go down, right? So traps can kind of break up into three components. I'll sort of draw a thick line here to denote the three components. Most people, if you come out of the Poliquin era, they would refer to this as trap 1, trap 2, trap 3. Some people call it the upper trap, or the middle trap and the lower trap. But you have to understand that each one of these has like a relative dynamic to it, which means the fibers are going to have control both when they are concentric and shortening of where the shoulder blade goes, but also if they run in opposition to another muscle, they're going to have an eccentric say on where and how far that shoulder blade goes, right? So to simplify things, we kind of have an upper trap that has a net vector here. We have a lower trap that could have a net vector here. We have a mid trap that could have a net vector here. And then if we think about the rhomboids, right, the rhomboids are going to have a net vector. So net vector just means like a force with a direction or the direction of a force, right? So now all of a sudden we have a bunch of different things playing tug of war, with this little bone island. And we also have the levator, right? So the levator scap can be a little annoying thing if you don't pay attention to it, which comes right off what we call the superior medial border of the scapula, which is like this is if you were to have such thing as scapular elevation, this would be the one to do it if it didn't have to deal with the passive tension of every other muscle that has to work on the shoulder blade, right? If we were just a shoulder blade suspended in space, attached at the AC joint, and we just had a levator at the superior medial border that could just contract and relax, then yes, our shoulder blade would just do this. It would go up and it would relax and go down. That would be it. That was all it would do. But it has to, as it contracts, it has to synchronize with the passive tension of, or in some cases, the active tension. Like in the case of the upper trap will actively contribute to that what elevation with, as it does have fibers that run vertical as you go more into the suboccipital region up the neck. So we have to always keep that in check. So we have rhomboids, we have levator, we have traps, both mid and upper and lower. And we also have, I don't know, let's go, I like this orange. The serratus anterior. Now I'm going to try and get really artistic with it. And now I'm going to increase the opacity here and kind of come off the rhomboids and then wait for it, wait for it. So the serratus anterior starts at the midline border of the scap, but it goes underneath the shoulder blade, right? So it's kind of running adjacent to the ribs, and then it becomes sort of emergent off what we call the inferior angle of the shoulder blade. So the lateral edge of the shoulder blade. Then your serratus anterior sort of comes around. This is where, if you're in the bodybuilding world, some people might talk about tie-ins. Bodybuilders have these cool tie-ins. It's like all that is you have a serratus anterior going one way. So the serratus anterior, for those of you following along, attaches onto the upper 8 ribs, but we have the external obliques, which attach onto the lower 8 ribs. Essentially, if we look at the image when we go back to the slides, or if you consider this on the whiteboard here, you kind of have this wicker basket of muscle fibers that when people get really conditioned, kind of like right around here, you're going to see, what's the word they use? Shark teeth projections. It's like, it's either someone who's never seen an oblique or someone who's never seen a shark tooth. You decide. Because I've looked at plenty of obliques and serratus, really lean, big people, and I've seen a few sharks because I go and hang out with Patty Roach and Jason in Australia, and I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and trust me, they don't look like shark teeth. They just look like a wicker basket of muscles overlapping each other, right? So again, serratus anterior, upper 8 ribs, external oblique, lower 8 ribs. Now you might be thinking, but Jordan, wait, we only have 12 ribs. And you are 100% correct. So you're going to get this overlap and intersection of these rib segments that have both a serratus going one way and an external oblique going another. And basically all these muscles do at the end of the day is laterally compress the rib cage and help with ventilation. A little bit more detail, but we'll leave it for that. So here we have, I'm going to draw the vectors here, right? Just the arrows. This is a little bit more complicated than just elevation, depression, protraction, retraction. And we can't ignore this, right? We can't just be like, well, you're overcomplicating. It's like, I look like I like I sleep on a mattress on the floor. Like I don't like overcomplicating literally anything. This is the requisite amount of complexity you need to be able to operate at to solve complex problems quicker as a trainer, coach, or therapist. That's it. I don't do anything more than I have to. I just do the exact bare minimum of what's necessary. And unfortunately, dealing with the human body is like kind of complicated. That's why I work in the easiest field. That's why I don't do neuroscience. That's why I don't do general surgery. That I just work biomechanics, which is like a little bit of neuroscience, I guess. But it's like just a requisite amount that I know how not only to put one foot in front of the other, but maybe how everyone puts one foot in front of the other. That's it. So when we go back to the slides, which I'll do quickly now, I want you to keep this model in your brain. Be like, oh, when we're dealing with the shoulder blade, we're dealing with a handful of muscles that work in sometimes exact opposite, like the lower trap and the upper trap are kind of complete opposites of one another, right? The serratus and rhomboid can kind of pull in two different directions. Like we need to respect these differences. And it's not just like when we contract a muscle, our body is, everything is dead and latent, but that muscle we're contracting, right? There's always going to be a push and a pull. Like if you look at this sling here between the rhomboids and the serratus, I'm going to kind of like make this very apparent. It's as if the shoulder blade is just sort of along for the ride. And it's just something that is cradled between the two. A pure concentric serratus is a pure eccentric rhomboid and vice versa, right? These become very, very important, and we're going to discuss these as we move along. So I'm going to move back to the slides, and we're going to move to our next layer of muscles. So we talked about bones and joints, right? We talked about clavicle, sternum, rib cage, thoracic spine, shoulder blade, humerus. Great. And then we moved on to joints, acromioclavicular, sternoclavicular, glenohumeral, scapulothoracic. And then we moved on to our first sort of array of muscles that primarily have to do with the shoulder blade. Right now, as we move on, we're going to talk about muscles that have to do with the arm, right? So now there's a few ways to categorize this, but we're going to go basically, if you're following along, we're kind of going from the inside out. And that'll be very important as we start to build our model in the latter half of the hour. So these guys here, supraspinatus, subscap, infraspinatus, teres minor, commonly known as the rotator cuff, right? So the rotator cuff, an easy way to remember this, if you guys, it's your first time and you're trying to remember it, which I think it's super useful to, is remember the acronym SITS, S-I-T-S. I wrote it this way because I've said done it 10,000 times, but supraspinatus or subscap, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscap. So take the two S's, put them wherever you want. Sits. So if you think rotator cuff on mnemonic, first time hearing it, trying to remember it, sits. Rotator cuff, sits. Subscap, infraspinatus, teres, supraspinatus. Boom, done. Okay. So this is commonly known as the rotator cuff. And this is important. Important in the sense that we need to understand, you know, a few nuanced characteristics about rotator cuff muscles when we try and train them in isolation, and then what they do when we try and integrate them into the rest of the system. So there's a big movement right now when we talk about resistance training, about like the pecs and the lats and the glutes and targeting particular fibers, which I think is to a certain degree useful to understand. Right. I think something more useful to understand is joint mechanics. And I think that it'll have a better predictive value towards your ability to grow tissue than some of the lines of pull stuff that we discussed, but I digress. We are going to dive into where I think the lines of pull conversation is probably the most pertinent, right? So for some of you listening, because I can't see any faces, I'm just going to explain what I mean when I say lines of pull. Easiest example is going to be like the pec, right? So, the pec is known to have different fiber orientations or like different directions pec fibers go. So if we kind of look at my hand here, I have like an index finger that goes up towards my clavicle, and I have a middle finger here that goes towards my sternum, and I have a pinky finger here. I'll stand on my tippy toes. A pinky finger here that goes down towards my ribs. This is a pretty okay-ish representation of like the pec muscles. So you might see someone go in the gym and press on an incline and press on a decline and do flies. You also might see people like put hands on plates and do this, which is like, don't do that one. The other ones are cool, but like this one, come on, it's 2024. So they are pressing and flying in different angles because the muscle goes on different angles, right? So not the majority, but a large conversation around biomechanics these days is about this very principle of like, well, how do I want to target, or how can I target the muscle fibers that go up here? It's like, well, I have to understand insertion and origin and the line of pull of that particular group of muscle fibers that go up towards my clavicle. In the case of the pec, we'd be talking about the clavicular fibers that span roughly to the medial 2/3 border of the clavicle, right? So the inside 2/3 of your shoulder blade. When you kind of run your finger along that, that's all mostly superficially pec fibers, right? So some people might be missing a bit of this and they want to train it. So they go specifically towards, in most cases, some sort of incline press if all set up correctly and all is equal. However, when we look at the rotator cuff, we kind of just forget about all that. We kind of just go like, meh, whatever. Let's just do a bunch of like warm-up-y stuff. And it's like, and this is where this is where we go low resolution, big picture, and things get a little foggy and people get in pain. And it's always the people with the really bad warm-ups and the very minimal understanding that seem to find themselves in a really bad way. So when we look at the rotator cuff, I'm going to share the whiteboard again. And we're going to kind of do the same thing we did with a scap. I'm going to draw another scapula. We're going to start from scratch here. And as we go through this, we're going to identify where the muscles are and where they pull, right? So we're going to go here, right? So we'll draw the dorsal aspect of the scapula first. So I've used the word dorsal and ventral a few times. The easiest way to remember this is whenever I say dorsal, think baby shark. You will, for the rest of your life, think of me with my right hand on the back of my head. Dorsal, think dorsal fin. That means to the back. Okay. Ventral is to the front, right? So anytime we use the word ventral, it means to the front. And every time we use the word dorsal, I mean to the back, right? And it's like, look, it's not complicated, right? It's not software engineering. It's just the human body. It's just words you may not have heard before. All good. Front, back, dorsal, ventral, Gucci. Great. Gucci is not an anatomical term, by the way. So when we're here, we have our scapula. Again, not my greatest work. Now let's throw a humerus in just for fun. And while we're here, boom, little tree, Bob Ross. Shout out Bob Ross. Shout out anyone who's heard the conspiracy theory that Bob Ross is just drawing pictures of where he buried the dead bodies and he's actually a serial killer. That's the version of Bob Ross that I want to pray to. So here we are. We're at the shoulder blade. We're talking about the rotator cuff. And we're going to draw in 3 of the 4 muscles on this image, and we'll draw in the 4th on an additional image. So the first one we're going to talk about is the supraspinatus or the supraspinatus. I'm going to make this a little bit brighter for you. When we go to here, the supraspinatus, it's named based off its position to the spine of the scapula. So this little ridge here, spine of the scapula, supraspinatus kind of comes straight across. Okay. And then we'll throw in, I don't know, let's go with that orange. There we go. Where are we at? There we go. Okay. Now we're going to go to the infraspinatus, below the spine of the scapula, right? Now, something interesting is going to happen, and I want you to pay attention. Notice and it's all going to sort of congregate over here. Notice as we draw these lines towards this common insertion, that just like the pec, we start to have a fiber orientation angle that changes, right? Put a pin in that. We'll return back to that shortly. Now we get into the teres minor, right? So the teres minor runs down just the lateral border of the scapula. So this is supraspinatus, teres minor, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. Now, what you might realize is that we have this spanning arc of muscles that run horizontally to muscles that run a little bit more obliquely and almost vertically. Just like training different fibers of the pec, right? Or just like training different fibers of the lat or glute, we're going to have to take into consideration lines of pull, right? So a lot of people experience issues with their rotator cuff as they bench press and as their shoulders are abducted or they're pressing in a higher incline position. You need to, just like under training an upper pec, it's probably because you're not lining up these fibers, right, with the resistance you're trying to use to strengthen them, right? So if I'm trying to, for example, train the smallest muscle of the rotator cuff, or one of the smallest muscles of the rotator cuff, the teres minor, we have to respect that, look, this teres minor is only ever existing on an angle. So in order for me to train it adequately, I need to start to adopt a line of pull. So I'm just drawing in like a new humerus here, a line of pull at my humerus that puts my arm in the overhead position, right? And this starts to make sense when you think of doing a pull-up, for example. So if I were to do a pull-up hanging in like just a pronated grip position, right? So it's an overhand grip position. And I think about what initiates the movement. I'm going to stand back. If I'm here in a dead hang position, the first thing I'm going to do is turn my elbows to the front of the room. That will create levered for my lat to extend my shoulder. Because if I don't do that, I'm just moving my shoulder blades through the frontal plane, and it's really more of an upper back movement. What does this initial movement of putting my elbows forward is this muscle, right? So the teres minor, which is relatively small, becomes really important when you put it in the right position, right? And a lot of people, when they have issues in particular positions, they have a hard time reverse engineering this simple, can't see you, just the whiteboard. Oh, interesting. Okay. See, it's this goddamn webinar feature. Please hold. All right, we're gonna do the pull-up thing one more time. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Good looks. So, huzzah, it is I. So when we're here and I'm in a pull-up position and I turn my elbows forward, no worries. As I turn my elbows forward to then extend my shoulders, what did that and allowed me to now use my lats as I externally rotate my shoulder was my teres. Right? So my teres minor is going to be the thing that in the overhead position externally rotates my shoulder. And all it's really doing is saying, hey, humeral head, get back here, right? If I'm hanging from a pull-up bar, my humeral head is distracting out of my glenoid. It is unstable. We call this muscle a stability, or people call this muscle a stability muscle. All it does when it contracts, it's going to kind of corkscrew the humerus into the shoulder blade, and in doing so, give the lat an advantage to extend the shoulder, right? It creates a bit of leverage. So lines of pull, when we talk about the rotator cuff, are super, super important, right? They're arguably more important than lines of pull when it comes to training pecs and lats, because if you have a rotator cuff that's ineffectual in a particular position, and that causes you pain and discomfort, that will have a greater net detriment to your physique and strength goal than if you're not accurately lining up your pec fibers, right? So it's really useful to understand this line of pull at the rotator cuff, if anywhere. So if you're just kind of going in like, yeah, last night was pretty cool. I don't know. Yeah, the Leafs won. Yeah, we really hope we can take. And you're just like wondering why your shoulders are so sore. But you then immediately, when you're done warming up, you go into the gym and you're just like breaking out your protractor. It's like, oh, hold on, dude. Like, if you're going to be really intentful with something, do it with these muscles, not necessarily these muscles. Trust me, the pecs and the lats, if you load them heavy enough for long enough, they'll kind of sort themselves out. And, you're maybe a long way from the Mr. Olympia stage. So like, just focus on the things that'll actually allow you to keep loading those muscles into the future, right? That's sort of like where I want this model to sort of take shape. So to kind of zoom all the way back, so far we've talked about the bones and the joints. Right? We've talked about the first layer of muscles, which is going to be muscles that act at the scapula. Now we talked about the second layer of muscles that's going to act on the scapula to the humerus. And lastly, and this is so important, especially when we start to talk about performance, when people are dealing with decreases in performance, and let's try and be consistent with our language, let's just leave it at that. We're not going to say pain. We're not necessarily going to say dysfunction. We kind of get lost in this middle bucket. We kind of get lost in this like rotator cuff chasing our tail. But if we think about just pure cross-sectional area, which is to say like how much muscle is on our skeleton in this particular region, when it comes to going from the shoulder blade to the arm, because we only differentiate insertion, origin, insertion in textbooks. So some of you might have a background in anatomy from the internet or from even school. Fuck, I went to school for like, I don't know, 9 years, and I learned insertion, origin. Muscles move from insertion to origin. Muscles move from insertion to origin. And then I like lifted weights and thought, wait a minute. No, muscles move from a point in which they're fixed to a point in which they're not. Right? So it's like, if I stabilize the distal end of something that should move and I move the part that's used to be stable, I can create a relative motion that's different than what insertion to origin says, right? So muscles just move from, towards a fixed point. Whether it's insertion origin doesn't really matter. And that's where arm training becomes super useful, super effective as we're building out our model, which we'll get to after hopefully getting a solid enough footing for us to move forward in. Is a lot of people get very hung up in the rotator cuff and its implications at rehab, which, like, yes, it definitely has its place. But if we want to talk about the big rocks, look no further than the big muscles, right? Because the big muscles are just going to be prioritized by your nervous system. So if you have delts that can train and be, strong in various positions, if you have biceps and triceps and lats and pecs that can be strong in various positions, you're going to have a muscle that runs pretty much kind of from the arm towards the skeleton, right? not necessarily, or not necessarily in some cases directly towards the shoulder blade, which is the case obviously for the pec, right? The pec's just going to kind of span across to the clavicle and the sternum and the ribs. It won't necessarily attach to the shoulder blade, but it's going to play a net force in the humerus. So if we think about, and I'll go back to the whiteboard here in a second, as I don't think I'm demonstrating anything else that you guys can't see in the interim. When we think about the humerus, it's very useful to understand the interplay of the muscles that we just had listed, right? So when I think about, right, drawing a scap, do I want to draw this from the front or the back? I'm agnostic, I don't care. So we'll go here, there's the humerus, spine of the scap, glenoid. Okay, so let's see, we're gonna have a deltoid. Right, deltoid is going to go here, lateral 2/3 border of the spine of the scap. And then we're going to have a tricep that goes infraglenoid tubercle. So like kind of that bottom aspect here, and your tricep's going to go down towards your elbow, and you got a couple heads that come off of, what am I doing? All right, so triceps. And then on the other side of that, I'll draw in the biceps in like the shaded way that we did last time. So biceps are going to attach up here. It's what's called the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. And they're going to kind of just run down here. And we have another one that's going to start. So I'm superimposing this. This is actually the coracoid process. But you get the idea. Each one of these, bicep, tricep, and delt, is going to have a net force that will approximate the humerus roughly, right? So when it comes to improving performance at the shoulder, a variable expression of strength across these three muscles, which means like, don't just do a bunch of preacher curls and think that that's going to be the solution for fixing everyone's problems. It might be the solution for fixing someone's problems who's very, 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 very novice and very, very, very detrained. But training the arms in variable positions, right? Like if I can do a tricep extension over my head, my tricep can be strong in an overhead position. This is likely going to allow me to continue to gain access to the overhead position over time, rather than just staying at this, what I'll call an inner valence of shoulder motion, which is like a lot of where the rehab world lives. We can really start to bleed this thought process out and be like, okay, well, we need these more peripheral muscles to start to contribute in these ranges we're hoping to attain, because if they don't know how to be strong there, they're just going to safe mode, right? Some of you might be too young. I don't know how. I like seeing faces. I like knowing maybe how not old I am by the look of some of you, or maybe by how old I am by the look of some of you. But like safe mode was a thing where when your computer got a virus because you were downloading Metallica's album on LimeWire, some of you, yeah, all right, Adam. So Adam gets it. Adam had LimeWire. Adam was a fully functional adult before the internet existed. And you got a virus and you had to explain to your mom that it was a Metallica album. And she was like, yeah, sure, the Metallica album. And you're like, fuck, this is awkward. Ugh. But your computer would like have this blue screen, and then you'd call the guy and he'd be like, can you restart it in safe mode? He'd like tell you the keys to press. And safe mode is basically like the point in which your computer knows the last time it was working properly. So like, fuck, I lost my homework, another Metallica album, damn it. And it's like, what happened is it just like kind of had this working memory of like, hey, the computer wasn't fucked up here, so let's just work and pretend like we're here again. Your shoulder kind of works like that, of like, look, if you're not super confident in your ability to get here, your body's going to go, I don't like working here, but I like working here. It's like, well, this is your overhead position now, right here. It's like, that's not really ideal. But if you can start to like sort of hack into the system a little bit and rewire that and teach a tricep to be strong there, teach a bicep to be strong there, and teach a delt to be strong there, you end up in a really good place, right? And if anything, you actually need that to cast mentally your ability to start to move in and out of these positions, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at building a bit of a model. Now, models, as I pull up the slide, share screen. I think I'd be better at this by now. All right. So we are going to build a model. Now, all models are wrong, just some seem to be useful. So, and that's true, right? Like we're going to build ourselves a tool that we can use based off principles that'll help us solve problems fast. And we need to understand that there are some problems that we are not going to be able to solve. And I think in understanding that actually makes our model more accurate, because we know when to use the model. Now, The model that we're going to, or the comparison we're going to make is, does anyone know what the little diagram with an N in the middle of it is called? Going back to grade 11 chemistry, or last week, if you make any sort of drugs in your house. Nucleus. Adam, Bohr, Eric Dahlman, Win. Hey, what's up, man? Good to see you. I don't know why some people's names show up and others just show up as null. But Eric, so it's a Bohr diagram, right? Bohr diagram. So the guys go back to grade 11 chemistry, N would make us assume that it's nitrogen. So hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen. So 7 electrons total. And once you look at that, 7 electrons. High school paid off. Thanks, public ed. Yeah, we're still waiting for chiropractic college to pay off for us. We'll get there, man. So when we look at this, well, why are we talking about chemistry all of a sudden? I swear this has a point. So we have a nucleus, right, which is the center gray circle with the N in it. And if you guys remember Bohr diagrams, remember a little bit about chemistry, the first valence is what these little circles are called around the solid circle, around the nucleus. The first valence has 2 electrons, right? And then the next valence will have 8 until it's full, and then 8 and 8 into infinity, right? So you have the nucleus and then 2 electrons, hydrogen, helium, and then boron, carbon, nitrogen, electron, hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and so on. So here we're dealing with nitrogen. When we are conceptualizing a working model of the shoulder region, I like to push people towards this approach. And the reason I like to, because it allows us to bin and categorize our approach into different regions, into different valences, into different buckets. I don't really care the language you use. I care the underlying principle that's exacted. So this is going to go a little bit far afield, but we're going to rein it in. When I usually ask people the core, or the nucleus rather, of the shoulder, I get a mixed bag of answers. I rarely get the answer I'm looking for, which is in fact the diaphragm. Now, for the purpose of today, and the purpose of creating a general heuristic that is usable almost immediately and solving most people's problems most of the time, we are going to bypass this. We are going to acknowledge it and be like, yes, the diaphragm is very important. Obviously, I've been breathing a lot and heavily for the last, wouldn't you know it, almost an hour. Don't worry, we're clearly going over. If you got a dip, all good. We'll keep this going. Just watch the rest from the hour mark. But the diaphragm can get just a little bit complicated. And look, the more complicated the conceptual underlying theory, usually the easier the application. And it's going to basically, and could you imagine what the application of breathing is going to be? You know what I tell people when I cue them to breathe? Inhale or exhale, either through the mouth or through the nose. However, when I'm using that strategically as a tool to improve whether mobility, stability, strength, whatever, the thought process that leads to me being that strategic is very, very in depth. And the application is usually for solving something more complex of a problem. And what we're going to see is, as we move from layer to layer, we end up solving slightly less complex problems. So we're going to work on the outer valence, because most people's problems, honestly, aren't that complex. One of the biggest problems that people have when it comes to the shoulder is they are just too weak. And I don't want that to sound disparaging. Like, look, people have busy lives that if you didn't get into weight training as a career, like, yeah, I take one day off and I'm like, I'm never training again. Nope, I'm done. I feel great. My nothing hurts ever when I wake up on a training day. The hardest day is to go back. The hardest is to take the day off. But once I've taken a day off training, I'm like, I quit. I quit. Life is way better. I slept last night. I don't have to take a bunch of powder that people try to tell me tastes like watermelon, but doesn't. It just tastes like chemicals. It's all bad. So like, I'm sympathetic to that problem, and it's a massive problem. And a lot of times the fix, as we build out our own valence model. So if we think about how we're actually going to do this, how are we going to apply this principle, and how are we going to, populate this working model of the shoulder so that we can use this as a tool to either training ourselves and training our clients, right? So when we look at, the nucleus, that's going to be the diaphragm, and we look at this first valence, and then second valence, and then third valence, we're going to identify, right? So that's diaphragm. This is going to be scapula. Actually, what am I doing? Sorry. This is going to be rib cage slash T-spine. Okay, so that's a rib cage and thoracic spine. This is going to be scapula, shoulder blade, and this last one here is going to be the humerus, right? And if you think about this and actually anthropomorphize this, think about this not as like a bullseye or a Bohr diagram, but think of it as almost like looking down on someone's skeleton, right? Like thinking about this almost like Russian nesting dolls. Like if I'm looking through the top of someone's head and I'm trying to imagine like the diaphragm and the rib cage and the scapula, like just drawing out from these eccentric circles from the middle. That's how I want you to really conceptualize it, because that's how they influence one another, right? So the diaphragm is going to contract and relax. It doesn't elevate and lower per se as much as it contracts and relaxes. As it contracts and relaxes, it manipulates the transient shape of the rib cage. As the rib cage shape starts to be manipulated over time, that affects the shoulder blade, which then affects the position of the arm. But it also works in reverse, right? Like it's not just from the inside out, it's also from the outside in. So for example of this, and we'll start to build out our model here in kind of bucketing the muscles that we've talked about into 3 different buckets. It's like we are going to look at when we come up with an approach. Maybe let's do this first. Okay, we have 80 people here. I want you guys right now, when you think of so what are exercises that come to mind when you think of shoulder corrective exercises? Like when you think of rehab, prehab, activation, whatever, warm-up drills to keep it super simple, what are the exercises that you guys think of? Yeah, no, of course, banded ER. Good, fill it up, dude, go nuts, fucking right. And look, here's the thing. None of these are bad. No exercise is bad. We just exist on scaled levels of efficiency as far as driving stimulus that a person can adapt to, right? Like, I see a lot of people do core activation drills like bird dogs and curl up and side planks. And it's like, that's totally fine if you're 100. I don't think it's doing anything for you if that spine that's robust enough to deadlift 300 kilos is trying to resist the force of being on one knee and one hand, right? So it's, we have to think of these as, I've used bird dogs all the time. I train a couple of people who are close to 100 years old. And it's like, yeah, that we meet them where they're at. These are great tools, right? So here we have a ton. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share the whiteboard again, and we're going to talk about building this model. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to start taking all of these. So banded ER, who said max bench press? Jesus Christ. Respect. If you can do that, you're, man, I don't know. Bench press of all exercises, just walk in off the street and go max effort is reckless. I'll probably do it with a deadlift, but bench is not. All right. So I'm going to write down the ones that, and feel free to toss some more in as we go. Right. So banded ER, cable ER, wall slides, Y, yeah, T, W. I think I's are another one. Just the whole alphabet. Ryan Hansen, my man. Good to see your name. Bear crawls, great exercise. Yeah, kettlebell, bottom under press, breathing into your chest. Yeah, fucking right, dude. And that's like a little bit, that's like some 4D chest shit. I'm going to leave it off the board. That's a little bit more of a diaphragm thing, but I fuck with it. Breathing into your chest, because that's where your lungs are. Don't breathe into your stomach. Good luck. Okay. Serratus push-up. Schwartz, what's up, man? Hope the wedding was awesome. Push-ups. Med ball breathing. Breathing, we're going to put in the diaphragm. Scap pull-ups. Single arm tricep extension. I like it. What I don't like is my handwriting. Apologies. Dips, abduction, adduction, L's, bottom under press bandage, shoulder dips, dead hangs, pullovers, serratus fly. All right, we soon got enough here to make my point. It was amazing. Good, man. I'm glad. High cable curls, windmill, high. Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at things that work at rib cage and T-spine. We're going to look at things that work at the scap, and we're going to things that work at the humerus. All right, so as we go through this, we're going to create an index. Now, an index, for those of you who are, I don't know, is anyone in here have Corey Wright? What up? No, not that. Sorry. Is anyone? No, I'm just saying hi to Corey. Not if anyone is Corey Wright. Does anyone in here have a birthday? Were you born in the 2000s or later? Anyone in here born 2000, 2001, 2002? Anyone born? Shut up. That's insane. Is anyone younger than that? Is anyone? 2003, dude, you're 4 years old. How are you? Mate, you could use a computer. You're Maggie Simpson. You probably don't know what fucking Maggie Simpson is. 2004. Bless your heart. Dude, good for you, though. I wasn't into this shit when I don't even know how, that's not, you're 10 years, you're 14, 2004, you're 14 years younger than me. You have your whole future ahead of you. I am so happy for you. All right. So, okay. So 2004, we're going to talk. You're right here. Hi, how are you? I hope you're good. You have to maybe live 14 years longer than me, which in the state of the world today, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we let the boomers make it so bad for you. You'll never own a home unless you want to live in the American Midwest, which you'll either have dreams or a home. So you'll never own a home. No, okay. I'm only partially joking. I'm not actually kidding. You've never opened a phone book in your life. Have you opened a phone book in your life? 2004. Do you know what a phone book is? Like you can know what a phone book is, but have you ever experienced going out to the front porch and picking up a phone book? Never. You know what? Fucking good for you, man. I want to trade lives with you. Okay, so that's one, hilarious. But two, so a phone book is like the OG index. And a phone book is a really good analogy to start to put together approaches in solving people's performance problems at their shoulders. So a phone book, giant index. It has yellow pages and the white pages, right? White pages of people, yellow pages is businesses. Right there, we have this like differentiating criteria. So if I got to look up, a tire shop or a florist, boom, I just go already. I go to these pages at the back that are yellow, and then I go, okay, what business do I need? Then we go into a sub-index, right? That sub-index of, so I don't have to deal with, Bob's tires next to Bob's flowers, right? We don't categorize by name first. We categorize or subcategorize in the category of business under the type of business. And then when we get to type of business, then we go through alphabetical, which is another indexing system, right? So what we're going to do with our approaches to improving performance at the shoulder is we're going to understand how to index per region so we don't end up doing the same thing by a different name, right? So I don't have to look up Eric Dahlman in the white pages next to the Eric Dahlman automotive or whatever, right? Like I know where to go to find the thing that I need. So what will often happen in the analogy of lifting weights and prescribing exercise is we have this big index of exercises and we just go, what was that? Oh, guitar. Okay. And this is how we program, regardless of who walks in the door. Like, I don't know, I work with some like pretty crazy fucking athletes. Like I think, who's the most athletic? Actually, I'm going to the Cirque du Soleil in a few weeks. And I think if I had to pick an athlete that I've worked with that is probably the freakiest, Cirque du Soleil athletes are probably up there. And I have this, that would be like me trying to pick, I don't know, what is 2024? Where you at? There you are. What is the first letter of your last name? It only shows up as null on the thing. I don't know if anyone else. What is the first letter of your last name? If you're still here. If not, I'll just make it up and assume it's later in the alphabet. Okay, he's gone. He probably had a curfew. All right. So when we're looking up, say his last name started with a M. If I were to try and find M in this really tiny, small, okay, L, there, no, yeah, well, let's go with it, L. So if I was trying to find our friend in the phone book and we knew he or her, sorry, I don't know your first name, his last name started with an L, I'll tell you what we're not going to do right away. Lisa. Oh, sorry, Lisa. I've been referring to you as you were some sort of bro this entire, and maybe you are a bro. Bro is an agnostic, universal term. You are bro Lisa. I would not try and find Lisa by going to this page of the book. No Lisa. Wouldn't you? Would you note we whole no Lisa right here on page 1, line 1. Hold on a second. Shit. You're not going to believe it. There's still no Lisa. Yet I watch people every day of my life in every gym I train in all around the world take someone that's mid 20s. I don't know if you're 2024, you're probably your early 20s. It's insane to me. And they go, okay, Lisa, we're going to pull out the big book of exercises and we're going to have you do this right here. Not understanding that Lisa's physical capability, like her last name, is much further progressed. So what we're going to do is we're going to build our own index to flip through, and it's going to allow us to start making very concerted decisions, very well thought out decisions about what exercises we are going to perform to meet our clients where they're at, right? So we have this giant list. Maybe it's going to load. There it is. We have this giant list of banded ER, cable ER. And now we just need to put all these pieces together. We need to put them in the right category, right? Like just like a city and a census looks at everyone in every business and goes, oh, fuck, it's a lot of people. We got to get phone numbers and addresses for a lot of people. And they don't just take them all and put them in a book and then throw it on Lisa's front porch, which never happened. They go, okay, we got all the names. Now divide by businesses and people. Great. And then, all right, we have all the businesses. Okay, divide them by types of business. And we have all the types of business. Okay, great. Then divide them alphabetically. Do that with your exercise. Like I literally mean go into a spreadsheet on your Google, or if you use Outlook, go to Google and start a Google account like an adult. And then once you have a Google account, open Google Sheets and use Google Sheets because no one wants an email from an outlook.com. It's basically the equivalent of like AOL, which Lisa also doesn't know what AOL is. And Corey Wright and Eric Dahlman definitely know what AOL is. And open up a spreadsheet with 3 tabs and then literally write these 3 as subheadings to the tabs. And we're going to take these exercises and let's see what fits where. Okay, let's see what fits where. Bear crawls. Okay, so that's a tricky one, right? Little bit of rib, probably anti-rotation, depends on how you do them. I would maybe put them somewhere in the scap, somewhere in humerus, but I'm going to put them purposefully down here. Bear crawls. Okay, so we knocked that off the board. Okay, kettlebell bottom under press, definitely going to be a humerus thing, more of a rotator cuff stuff. Dude, AOL, wild times. I think AOL in a chat room means you were going to go missing. Like there are some kids, RIP, who the last thing they saw was at AOL.com email address. It was morbid. Okay. I literally watched to see how many people left. Okay. Jake's with me on that. Jake's from the Midwest. Okay. So kettlebell bottom under press. So I'm going to put this here and I'm going to explain why I'm putting them sort of at the depths that I am. Serratus push-up. Now, serratus, we know acts on the scap and probably going to put it here. So serratus push-up. Trying to write as neat as possible. So it's a little bit slower. So scap pull-ups. So it kind of gave it away, right? So scap pull-ups, I'm probably going to put, I'm going to put them here. Scap pull-ups. Okay. And feel free if anyone, as I'm doing this, has any other like grand ideas. Windmill. Windmill is tricky. Some of you might be familiar. Kettlebell overhead should be a serratus exercise only if you have the amount of trunk rotation necessary. So if you don't have the trunk rotation, it's a trunk rotation exercise. Corey, got you. Dips in there. But if you do have slightly, yes, Eric, we'll cover that in a second. If you, what was I saying? Windmill, right? If you do have adequate rotation, not necessarily just through your trunk, but through your hips, and you can do this, no problem, it's a serratus exercise. If you can't, it then becomes a trunk rotation exercise. So I would say, just for continuity's sake, I would put that maybe here. I'm gonna sneak it in here. I think it should be here. Windmill. And look, over time, my lists have changed and how I put things relative to others. And sometimes my lists change based on the person I'm training. Right? Some people just the most basic exercise in the world they can't do. We had a kid from Georgia. He plays a corner safety for Green Bay Packers. He got drafted 3 years ago. He was a 4-year sprinter at Georgia and was a 4-year. Is he a safety? Yeah, no, defensive back. He was a defensive back, and he was a 4-year track star. Ran 100 meters, and he was also a defensive back for Georgia. Went to a few national championships. This kid ran a 10-100 meter with 2 torn hamstrings at the end of a football season. And I couldn't get this guy to do a lunge properly. I'm like, you are literally the epitome of gait cycle mechanics. He's one of he had the fastest 40 that year. He ran like a 4.23 40, like 195 pounds, 6'3", like freaky athlete. He had like a lightning bolt tattoo behind his ear, fitting. And you couldn't get this guy to do a lunge properly. Like he always lunged with the same shoulder inflection as the hip was inflection. I was like, dude, how are you figuring this out at 23 miles an hour and you don't know how to do it going 0 miles an hour? So your lists, right? Because what you're seeing that I'm doing, where I put windmill, kind of snuck him in there. I'm kind of just taking all my experience of me dealing with people and thinking which one of these is relatively more difficult and might bring with it relatively more scalable stimulus than the next thing. That's the whole game. That's my indexing. That's my indexing criteria. So as we go through, right, dips, for example, like dips are going to be down here. Dips are like really lower trap heavy as far as like doing them properly. If I do a dip properly, at the top of the dip, my shoulders are away from my ears. If at the top of my dip, I'm here, my lower traps will have done nothing to pull my shoulder blades into downward rotation, right? So dips I would confidently put at the bottom of that list. Windmills, you kind of dance around. Pullovers, depending on how you do them, we'll leave those aside because you kind of see we're kind of stacking up in one place. So banded ER, I'm going to put banded ER here because it's way less loadable than cable ER because we have an inconsistent profile, right? I like that straight arm on a bench supported. So that's like a frontal plane. That could be, and what I like about that exercise is it could be anywhere, but I'm going to put that side bend here. Hi, by the way. Side bend, right? So it's a frontal plane rib cage drill. Landmine overhead press should be more scat. Fairly loadable. I don't know. I could probably put it here. Landmine press. Okay. Eyes, Ys, Ts, Ws. I don't know. They're probably Ws are probably more external rotation. T's and I's, I think, are I's, T, and Y. I'm going to put Y in here reluctantly because Y raises aren't actually a lower trap exercise, but we'll save that for another time. Well, yes. So we'll get to that. So I got it. Wrap it up. All right. So what we're going to do here, but look, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I get your point. It's running long wherever you're at. Let's create another index that allows us to accurately divide this even more. When you're dealing with a rib cage and T-spine, you're going to be working with primarily 2 ranges of motion, right? You're going to either be dealing with flexion or extension, or you're going to be dealing primarily with rotation, right? So if we did like thread the needle or book openers or around the world, that would all fall under rib cage rotation exercises. And then we would have another classification of exercises, whether it's cat cow, which is a really common one, or foam roll T-spine extension. All of those drills can categorize under this. So it's not just we have the bifurcation of ribcage T-spine drills that we can bucket in, right? Just like we don't all have all the businesses just go into business, right? We have, well, no, they go into business and then type of business and then alphabetical. So when we're dealing with breaking down the sub-regions of the shoulder, what we should be dealing with to make a very fast decision that's very personalized is like, does this person need more rotation? If so, in my index of rotation drills, what is the relative complexity that this person can handle while still overcoming? Pick that drill, right? Because a lot of people get into the idea that they need to start overloading these drills. What you need to do is start overloading through picking more complex loadable drills. So I've seen people do like a bird dog exercise and start to load them. They don't know how to index exercises properly, right? So when we deal with rib cage and T-spine, just to make this clean, I want you guys to, as you go out and make your exercise indexes, right? So if we think rib cage, we're going to spell rib cage right. Rib cage / T-spine, I want you to create two primary indexes, right? So the primary index for this region is going to be flexion and extension for one, and then rotation as the other, right? So this is sort of bucket number one. And then when we go to scapula, we can subdivide into primarily upward and primarily downward rotation, right? So when we look at bucket number two, we can look scapula upward, and this is going to be more of those serratus drills. And then if we go downward, this is going to be more rhomboid lower trap drills, right? So upward and downward rotation. And then when we go to number three, we're going to look at things that manage internal and external rotation, right? So you can break these down by IR and ER. And then what you can do is you just sub-index your exercises accordingly there. And then when you're going to put things together, and this is where things become, I think, really important, is what you'll notice, say, for example, we're going to put together, a training day, A1, A2, A3, A4, and you have someone who, I don't know, maybe we're doing bench press. My shoulders hurt when I bench. Okay, are you addressing the full shoulder before you get into bench press? Let's see. Let's pick a drill from bucket number one. Let's pick a drill from bucket number two or valence number two. Let's pick a drill, and then let's pick them based off of whether or not we think we need more flexion extension or more rotation or more upward rotation or more downward rotation or more internal rotation and more external rotation. And then what you can do is you put this exercise Mad Lib together, you're going to find a movement signature where your performance increases, right? And then what you're going to take away from this, and this is the key point I'm trying to make, right? Outside of just picking exercises from these three zones, because it's not about picking exercises from these three zones and just doing these as a warm-up and that's it. It's about taking the core principle of these three buckets, these three zones, and figuring out exercises that carry with it that as a secondary characteristic of the exercise you're performing. So let's take this for an example. Let's go cat, cow. So this means flexion and extension of the T-spine. Maybe they need more T-spine extension. It's more rare than people think. People do it all the time. However, it's still in some cases possible to be limiting T-spine extension. So we give them more T-spine extension. And once you know it, as they integrate into warm-up set one and warm-up set two, and they kind of go back around and they do these in between, and then they get into their working set one, all of a sudden, this feels better. And as a byproduct of feeling better, it starts to be loaded heavier. And this is the performance metric that we're tying our decisions to. Like, hey, started doing this, my shoulders feel good, I'm benching more weight. Great. Feeling good and doing more, we always want to link together. Subjective and objective progress. That is true evidence for us that we're making a proper decision. But let's say, for example, on days we don't do this, and we're going to do thread the needle instead. And like, I really don't feel as good on days I do this. Like, okay, great. We have indicated that cat-cow sagittal plane movement through the T-spine and rib cage has made you feel better. But as we go into the rest of our workout, right, whatever that workout consists of, this element here, when we've solved for this as a variable, can help inform other thought processes that dictate our exercise selection, right? So once we've gone through a primary lift, right, all of our other exercises can be geared towards gaining access, at least partially, access to range of motion that might be deficient as potentially a byproduct of our primary lift. So what does this look like? I don't know. If you're going to do bench pullovers, you could be doing this very logically to train your lats. Some people do it to train their pecs. I would probably stick to lats. But this is going to carry with it a secondary characteristic while training your lats of driving a ton of T-spine extension, right? As opposed to someone who doesn't take the essence of this thought process, right? The essence of these three buckets, these three zones, these three valences. This gives us real-time data on how to select our further accessory exercise selection based off a list of like meta tags in your brain that you assign to. So as you go through and you make these lists, don't just stop at, and you'll see some people who used exercises like dips and single arm bicep curls. Those are exercises that you don't consistently see in a warm up, but they're emblematic of this thought process, right? So if someone does a trap 3 raise here, and you go, oh, wow, I feel a lot better when I do a trap 3 raise before I bench press. Then, okay, what does the trap 3 do? Well, it pulls the shoulder blade down. Well, when do we need that? Well, you can either do pull-ups, which are going to pull the shoulder blade down, or we can do dips, which are going to resist the shoulder blade going up. So these exercises could be informed not only by like, oh, I want to train like my upper back and my lats and do pull-ups, and I think they're a great exercise, but can also be informed by the secondary characteristic that we've proved to be, I'll use the word ergogenic, improved performance, by including it in isolation against the variable of our most loaded exercise. So when we look to organize a strategy for improving performance at the shoulder, regardless of dysfunction or pain, we want to take the essence of what is useful and integrate that into the thought process that helps drive our decision-making for our accessories moving into the workout and into our exercise program. Because the accessory work you do here is the warm-up you don't have to do tomorrow. And that's the key. Once you get to a point where you can walk in and just do pull-ups as your first exercise, or dips as your first exercise, or lunges as your first exercise, that carry with it, a meaningful amount of primary stimulus, which is usually in most people's cases, mechanical tension geared towards, say, Sean, geared towards driving, a hypertrophy stimulus at a particular tissue, but also carry with it a ton of ancillary benefits, secondary characteristics of improving underlying joint mechanics, improving some of these mechanistic or characteristic properties of the shoulder. We can start to be way more efficient with our workouts and bridge the gap between just corrective exercise, right? And then exercising correctly, right? So that's the key takeaway. It's not just like, here's how you warm up, do something for the scap, something for the T-spine and ribcage, something for the humerus. It's figure out which of those properties specifically is beneficial to your movement signature, and then take the essence of that benefit and see where you can inject it throughout your workouts as a secondary characteristics of more direct loaded exercises that are going to be more primary towards building strength or building muscle. So that's going to be the essence of it. So when you go out and you guys build a heuristic, and I challenge you, if you guys work in the field, to do this, to get a Google sheet or to get a pen and a pad and drill people, or sit down and watch people in the gym and just go like, yeah, what exercise is that? Okay, that's a face pull. Okay, well, what does the face pull do? Well, nothing really, but what do people think it does? It's like, well, if it's supported, maybe it's more of a rhomboid mid-trap exercise. Okay, that goes in this bucket. And then you just put it there. And if someone's going to come into you in train with you, and they're going to go, oh, okay, what do you like to do to warm up? I usually do band pull aparts, and then I do face pulls, and then I do W's or T's or I's. I'm like, well, you just pick one. They're all the same thing, right? So it's about minimizing redundancy to maximize efficiency. But the way you really truly maximize, and this is what gets lost, and this is the challenge I want you guys to take away with, depending on what level of comprehension you guys are at, is where do we see these properties in the conventional exercises that we're already doing, right? Someone mentioned high cable bicep curl. What is that? Well, it passively pulls us into upward rotation, right? So I tag a high cable bicep curl, not just a fully shortened bicep exercise, but I tag it as an assisted upward rotation drill. So if someone has a hard time getting their shoulder blade away from their spine, then I'm going to give them this bicep curl that literally pulls their shoulder blade towards their spine. And rather than doing wall slides into infinity, I can do some of those at the beginning, where they're pushing the shoulder blade away from their spine. And then I can double down on this effort here. If someone has a hard time pushing their shoulder blades away from their spine, and I choose an incline bicep curl, and their inability to move their shoulder blade is debilitating and causes pain, this is not going to really allow us to get our shoulder blade away from our spine as my arms get pulled behind me, right? So that is the key. That is the takeaway. So when we look to like fix our shoulders, sorry again for the stupid marketing efforts, but we want to fix our thought process. We want to have a thought process. We want to see things mechanistically. And the end goal ultimately is going to be, can we make corrective exercise just exercising correctly, right? So that's going to be the key. I am going to stick around. If you guys have questions, that's a wrap for today. But seriously, like if you guys spent an hour and a half, do this and refine it. And you'll refine it based off of someone's ability. You'll refine it based off your ability to teach and cue some of the movements. I have movements I like that I cue and teach more often, that I use more often, because I'm good at them, because I use more often. That someone else might like something else, and I go, oh, you like that one better? Okay, we're gonna do this one instead. But understand where this fits, right? It's addition by subtraction. That's the goal. We want to have a complex thought process that allows us to execute very simply. And that's when you have done the requisite work, and the decisions you're making, you can make with confidence. So I'm going to wrap this. I'll pull slides already off. Good. If you guys have any questions, I'll stick around for 10 or 15 minutes. Feel free to toss it in the chat. If not, if I don't get any questions, it's 8:27. Yeah, of course. Yeah, dude, of course. If you guys have, and if you guys leave and like, look, it's fucking a Friday night or a Saturday morning. Either way, time is precious. If you guys ever have questions and you're still here, shoot me an email, jordan@themuscledoc.com. I'm always happy to chat. If you guys have issues with your shoulders, feel free to message me. But if not, I'll take you guys, or I'll see you guys when I see you. If you need anything, let me know. I will stick around for another 3 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. If not, we'll see you guys on the other side. Okay, good. Let's see. Hard time keeping shoulders back when pressing. Feels like they're going to explode. What would you recommend? Is it all right? So I'm gonna go back and forth on these questions. So I'm gonna have some follow-up questions. So I'm assuming bench pressing. Yeah, you'll get the recording in an email tomorrow. Okay. Now, are you a wider grip bencher or a narrower grip bencher? Middle. This is 90 degrees. This is 0 degrees. Where is your arm when your thumb crosses your chest or gets to your chest? Sorry. 90, 0, 60, 45. Okay. Now, do you feel pain in the front of your shoulder or the back of your shoulder? Front. Okay. Do you have a big arch or a small arch? Big arch. Oh, when you bench press, arch. Chest up, big or relatively flat? Big arch. Okay. Good. This is what I thought. So for those of you still here, all 52, that's cool. I appreciate you guys hanging out and following through this thought process. Big arch bench press, pain at the front of the shoulders. Now, maybe one more question before I get into my thought process. Pain at the front of the shoulders, is it worse when the bar is on your chest, or worse on the unrack, or consistent throughout? End of the set. Okay, so here's usually what happens with big arch benching. Big arch benching, you got to realize, is decline benching, right? So if I arch really big, my shoulders, still having to press the bar straight up, have to internally rotate more than if I don't have to bench with such an arch, right? So when we look at someone on a decline bench, and if we were just look at the angle of their sternum, like on a true decline bench, and we looked at someone on a flat bench with a big arch, their rib cage position is in the same position, right? It's still like on this decline position, whether or not the decline was fabricated by your own spinal extension or by just the position of the bench putting you on that decline. So usually when we have shoulder pain, when it comes with high arch benching, you're lacking internal rotation of the shoulder, right? So most people attribute the bottom of the bench press to external rotation. Not necessarily the case. So if we think about it here, like this is internal, this is external. If I'm incline pressing or overhead pressing, yes, external rotation to get into the overhead position. Our skeletal kinematics or arthrokinematics totally support that. But if I'm even just logically, if I'm here and I go into a big arch position, in order to keep this, I have to internally rotate my shoulders more, even at 45 degrees, internally rotate my shoulders more. So what I would suggest is, well, how can we help improve that? It's like, one, you can help put the scapula in a position to better internally rotate the shoulder. Two, you can help. So I would say, maybe summarize this in an exercise, do very underloaded dips until you can do body weight dips. I find people who struggle with heavy internal rotation pressing is just oftentimes they're loading at the range of their ability to load into internal rotation. And a dip is the most amount of internal rotation we will have in a pressing motion. So if you're bench pressing and you feel like your shoulders are going to explode, I would imagine dips might be problematic. If Right, okay, good. But dude, this is awesome. So what I would do is like go to one of those weight supported dip stations. Put the pin on the very bottom. Get all the support you can and slowly get used to the scapular mechanics. I still want you to bench at press at 45. So when people do dips, right, either they tuck their elbows in too much and that causes more pain, or they flare their elbows out too much and it causes pain. So still find that 45 degrees, or do it on like a pin or plate loaded dip machine. So you can start to load, at lesser weights, obviously, than what you can bench. But I want you to stay within a pain threshold, but just get used to pressing from a super internally rotated position, so that when you get to what will then hopefully be a much less internally rotated position in a high arch bench press, you'll have built that property of the scapular position. You'll build that property of the rib cage position. You'll have built that property of the humerus position. You'll have built strength in that position as well. So I would say, we can go into the weeds about breathing drills and scapular mechanics and all that. I would say if it's load to tolerance on a dip machine or a weight supported dip machine, and then start to build that capacity to press with internal rotation, and then watch how, once you have that property trained, you can translate that property to high arch bench pressing. So hopefully that helps. And if not, shoot me an email. Yeah, of course. Yeah, give it honestly, like that trends so well. People who high arch bench, who need more internal rotation, that don't have it, that don't train it outside because they don't have it, and it's just this vicious circle that compounds. So yes, good luck. All right, let me scroll back. I had a grade 2 separation of the AC joint 15 years ago, and I've been lifting around 8 to 9, but bench is always oh, so you're Australian, got it. As it feels as it loads that area. Dips make the shoulder feel like it's going to explode. Should I be looking towards the lower trap? And Terry, I would say start with just iso holds, depending on your relative strength of body weight, in the top of a dip position. So like what I mean by that is, if you can, just get to a parallel bar, hold yourself at the top of a dip position and just hold. Try to keep your rib cage stacked, maybe get your toes a little bit out in front of you, so like you're not hyperextending through the spine, trying to find another muscle to stabilize with, and stay in this stacked position and just push away for as long as you can. Then what I would do after that is do side bending drills 3 or 4 times a week. So side bending drills of the rib cage and the trunk. That type of trunk mobility, that type of rib cage mobility, and the frontal plane movement of the scapula that's going to promote, paired with a bit of lower trap work, I would start there. AC joint, and it's funny because earlier in the webinar, I said, hey, look, we're going to put a pin in this idea that the AC joint is the joint between the clavicle and the shoulder blade. I find one of the things that's most often missed when prescribing like corrective exercises for an AC separation, and let's be serious, if you separate your AC joint, you're going to have to take a step aside, do some work that you need to focus on and stabilize in that area, and then step back into your regular training. Don't look at it as stepping back, but stepping aside. And you need to categorize exercises by things that stabilize the shoulder blade. So a lot of times with AC joint separations, people look at doing stuff like the teres and the infraspinatus. It has nothing to do with it, right? It's an issue between your shoulder blade being stable on your clavicle, which is sort of this hook that your shoulder blade kind of rests in. It's like, all right, well, that hook isn't as securely attached anymore. I need to use more muscles. So, I like a side bend with like my arm straight out, my 2 feet on a bench, and letting my torso move to the frontal plane, because it allows me to start to control that scapular movement again. And what I need to reintroduce safely without pain is the scapula to dynamically stabilize, which doesn't mean just not move at all. That's what a lot of people miss the boat on stability. They go, oh, stability is resisting force. It's like, yes, but it doesn't mean not moving. Right? We see core stability drills and everyone's rigid. It's like, no, that's not what stability is. Stability is our ability to dynamically resist force while something else is moving, right? So I would start with that. With AC joint stuff, just ISO holds at the top of a dip, like a really good trap 3 exercise. And then I would get a ton of frontal plane movement of the rib cage, which is controlled upward and downward rotation of the scapula. Whenever we're trying to fix an overhead position, we want to think about reaching low first. So fingers crossed. I get a lot of pain at the front of the shoulder performing rear delt exercises in any capacity. Okay. So it depends on the arm path, I think is the biggest thing. So I would stay away from, so it actually sounds like what you're experiencing is AC joint irritation, especially if you're doing rear delt flies bilaterally on a machine, right? If I have things pushing out on my pinkies here as I'm doing this, I'm getting a ton of compression through my clavicles, through my AC joint, right? So if I'm doing rear delt flies like this, first we need to respect the fact that our arm does not like to go into hyperextension in a perpendicular position to the floor or a parallel position to the floor. So at 90 degrees of abduction, our arms do not like to go behind our body very well, right? So watch what happens when I do that. If I'm back here and I'm pulling my arms back, my front of my shoulder pushes forward. Same thing is true if my arms are at my side, right? So if my arms are at my side and I pull my elbow back, the front of my shoulder rolls forward. However, if my arms are about 45 degrees and I pull my arm back, my front of my shoulder doesn't go forward anymore, right? So this is like an arthrokinematic principle, is somewhere between 45 to 60 degrees, depending on your size and shape. There's a point where your humerus will glide into hyperextension very easily. If you look at what the rear delt does, the rear delt is a hyperextender of the shoulder. Like think about how you train your back. If I were to train my lats, I'm going to go from whatever up here to here and not much further, right? I'm not going to train my lats by doing this. Why? Because my rear delt takes over. It's like, right, it's a hyperextender. The only problem is your joints don't really like to hyperextend in this position. Your joint likes to hyperextend in this position, right? At 45 degrees. So they don't compensate through the front of the shoulder here. So what I'm going to do is I would suggest doing single arm rear delt flies. And I would suggest never have your hand or have the load inside your AC joint. So let's say the cable is right here. I'm going to stand and I'm going to pull the cable off the rack. So I'm set into it. I'm going to start a little bit higher than my shoulder and I'm going to pull down to this 45 degrees. Right. So I'm going to start here, let that internal rotation happen, and then externally rotate as I hyperextend at 45 degrees. A lot of people get that. Very common presentation, like bilateral AC joint pain when doing rear delt flies. Part of the reason is as you come back and you're trying to really get that squeeze, the front of your shoulder is rolling forward, right? And you're causing irritation throughout the entire. Now, you should be able to get to a point where you can do it. Like, we're not fragile. We shouldn't lean away from it. But that's something that I would start with. Single arm cable rear delt flies allow for protraction and internal rotation as the hand crosses 90 degrees of flexion, and then really focus on hyperextension at that 45 degrees. So, Mr. Hansen, scapular winging in your experience, what is the most effective drill, the exercise to fix it? Okay, so scapular winging, for those of you who are like kind of unfamiliar, scapular winging is when we sort of get this visual presentation or representation of a scapula, an inferior angle, a bottom corner of the scap. It's not really sticking to the rib cage. Now, if that's present while loading, one of the things you'd want to focus on is, so the common thing focused on is the serratus. People are like, oh, okay, you have a weak serratus. And it's like, look, maybe that's definitely possible. But just as we can bring the shoulder blade to the rib cage with the serratus, right? Like I could do that and I can, you know, I'm upwardly rotating my shoulder blade and it's kind of adhering itself to my scapula, or sorry, my scapula to my rib cage. Hold on. I've been talking for 2 hours. This is iced tea, not a beer. I'm not Stone Cold Steve Austin. There we go. Just so we know it's not alcohol. It'd be nothing. So just so we can bring just as we can bring our shoulder blade to our rib cage, we can also bring our rib cage to our shoulder blade. So a lot of times when you're dealing with wing scapula issues, you're dealing with a rib cage that's incapable of expanding into the scapula, right? So this is where the breathing, it's like a little bit more of a complex problem. One of the issues that people have when they're trying to fix this is when we're doing serratus things and we're worried about just the muscular contraction of the serratus, we're always at arms at 90 degrees doing this, or above 90 degrees doing this. When we're trying to focus on the breathing aspect of bringing our rib cage, expanding it outward into our scapula, we can't have our shoulders at that level of flexion. Earlier, when I was talking about scapulohumeral rhythm, I mentioned that it's not a 2-to-1 ratio of the arm moving to the shoulder blade moving. That's where this principle plays in. So when we think about the shoulder blade's involvement in overall shoulder movement, the shoulder blade becomes more active as we get into the overhead position. So if we break the shoulder down into 3 components of like the first 60 degrees, sorry, I'm like trying to raise my arm so you can see it. The first 60 degrees, give or take, the scapula doesn't really move at all. As we go from 60 to 120, the scapula becomes increasingly more involved. And as we go into the overhead, the scapula is almost the only thing moving. And we know this. We can verify this with what we know about muscles, right? So when we think about, let's think for a lateral raise, because this is really important. It's a great question. When you can verify what you know about skeletal mechanics with what you know about muscle mechanics, you have 2 reference points to validate your hypothesis. So let's walk this through. If you go to the gym and you see someone doing a lateral raise like this has to do with your question about how do we fix wing scapula, but it's a principle that I think is super important that I want you guys, especially if you guys are sticking around and if you're watching this later, try and like just think about this. Full arc of abduction, 180 degrees, right? So we saw in that diagram, 60, 120, 180, shoulder blade gives 60 degrees, right? What initiates scapular, or what initiates abduction of the shoulder? The supraspinatus, right? What does the supraspinatus do? Well, it moves the humerus on a scapula. Does it move the scapula? No, it doesn't move the scapula. Okay, so it kind of moves 15 degrees. Guys, supraspinatus is doing its thing. And then once you know it, watch this point right here on my shoulder. Oh, wrong shoulder. This point here on my shoulder. As my supraspinatus pulls my humerus into my scapula, this deltoid tuberosity now has an ability to produce force. And then I take it to about here, right? So when I do a lateral raise to about 120 degrees, why do I not then take that lateral raise all the way up? Because everyone's like, oh, it's just too upper trap dominant. Right. Upper trap moves the shoulder blade. So we know at the bottom, we're really just moving our arm in our shoulder blade, right? Our shoulder blade is fixed if we're in the first 60 degrees of motion, because the muscles that move it don't act on the shoulder blade. Once I get to here, now my serratus begins to upwardly rotate. My rhomboids become eccentric. And then when I get to here, my traps assist my serratus in pulling my shoulder blades around. So when we're dealing with an issue like wing scapula, and we start to dig into the more nuanced breathing diaphragm part of solving more complex issues, we want to think about taking a breath in and expanding the space in between our rib cage. Now, that's a really difficult thing to do without a ton of constraints. So, you might lay someone on the floor with their arms reaching down their sides and then have them take a breath in. The very constraint of them laying on the floor will displace the contents of their thorax posteriorly and help them start to take a breath in. The problem is when people try and do this under load, they start to load the rhomboids and the serratus. If I'm trying to do that with a bunch of weight in my hands, my rhomboids, whether they're fully lengthened or shortened, are going to stop that air from really driving space in between my shoulder blades and pushing the rib cage back into the scapula that might be quote unquote winged. So you got to be really careful, because a lot of times people try to train the serratus and they train the serratus with arms at like 90 degrees or 120 degrees. It's like your scapula is a little bit too active to let that sling that we drew. Remember that's the sling of the serratus and rhomboids. You need that to be totally chill so that you can actually take a breath in and expand the space in between people, in between their shoulder blades, and expand the posterior aspect of the rib cage. Because most people in any other position, when they take a deep breath in, they expand underneath their sternum and upper ribs, causing more compression, which is going to take, like, I think of wing scapula kind of like this, where it's like here's that shoulder blade we had, right? I want a shoulder blade that sits in a nice convexity, right? So we have the concavity of the ventral aspect or the anterior aspect of the shoulder blade that should sit on the ribs like this. But what if the ribs are like this? It's like, well, yeah, you're going to have that kicking off to the side, right? So how do I get this rib cage to do this? It's like, well, I breathe into it, right? And if I can start to drive that rib cage towards the scapula, you're not going to have the wing scapula issue. So just as wing scapula can be an inability to use the serratus to pull the shoulder blade towards the rib cage, it can also be an inhibition in your rib cage dynamics from breathing your rib cage into your shoulder blade. So good question. Complicated, again, complicated in its theory, but very simple in its application. Get someone to lay on the floor, have them with heels up on a bench, resting, maybe dig the heels in a little bit to get a posterior tilt so the pelvic and thoracic diaphragm is stacked. Have them reach towards the bottom of the bench where their feet are resting on. And then as they're reaching, just take a breath in through their nose, nice, low and slow, and do 10 reps of that as they reach, and then get up, do some serratus stuff, and then get on with it and see how they feel. Go-to exercises for grade 1 or 2 AC separation. Grade 1 or 2, probably a cable side lateral raise in the shortened position, and then working into the mid-range and then lengthened. Maybe some sort of carry, dips to tolerance. I've had an issue with both horizontal and vertical pressing. I was wondering if you might be able to talk through, figure it out. Oh, okay, so horizontal and vertical pressing. It depends on where your issue is. Like, is it an elbow issue? Is it a shoulder issue? Contextual to the conversation we're having. Yeah, I would need some more details. Yo, sorry. I know this. You use the C word and you're from New Zealand. That's my bad. But I appreciate the Mr. Miller. It's been a while, aka this morning since I've seen you last. Okay, Amber, great. No pain, but my right arm wings out on higher effort lights, close to failure, and also right shoulder doesn't seem to elevate as well. Great. I would look at specific rib cage drills through the frontal plane, right? If we're seeing a flare, that means something's trying to abduct, right? If something's trying to abduct, it means something else isn't abducting. Now, it can be an abstract concept to think about abducting at the rib cage, but frontal plane movement and mobility of the ribs helps us drive air beneath our rib cage to support the pressures, the compressive forces we put on it. So a big one, if you bench press a lot or press a lot, you need to start to create space to continue to compress, right? So doing something like a side bend, which can be like side bending off a bench, like hold your arm out straight, put your 2 feet up on a bench, let your ribs move to the side, and then move back up. Or even simple side bending like you see when people are like trying to train their QLs or obliques or whatever, dumbbell in one hand, and just get some ability to move the ribs through space. Our ribs are meant, this is a Kyle Baxter finger puppet thing. So shout out Baxter for this. I think they're meant to move in space. And as we compress and contract on them, they lose their mobility. So when I see a flaring out of a shoulder, I see a need for abduction somewhere. I would look inward for that abduction. See if we can get some frontal plane movement of the scapula and some frontal plane movement of the rib cage. What do you think about frozen shoulder? It's adhesive capsulitis is very, very overdiagnosed. Question, whoever asked the adhesive capsulitis question, are you from the UK? Because I feel like it's really overdiagnosed in the UK. Yes, I appreciate whoever left and said that they appreciate for the top. Oh, yeah. So thumbs forward, right? I would say like parallel bars, but depending on what your starting position is, I would just want my arms at my side, right? I don't want you here, but I want your rib cage stacked. And that's tricky because you need to dissociate. Some people will go here or they'll go here, and whatever position leads you to a stacked rib cage and pelvis, because that's the real money shot. When you're in that iso hold, taking a breath in, you're really going to do repetitions of breaths rather than just repetitions of like concentric, eccentric, concentric, eccentric. I want you to take repetitions of breaths through your nose. Thanks, Jordan. Halfway through Cairo school. Fucking right. Cairo school. Good luck. My right shoulder permanently sits lower, probably from carrying a backpack on the shoulder in the 90s. Yeah, fucking right. When I'm conducting neutral pull-ups, similarly, I find that I dig one shoulder blade back into the bench when shoulder pressing, chest pressing. Curious of what the issue is. Could be an underlying rotational problem. Like, look, and this is key. That's a good question. So I'll read it from the beginning, so I know who, so you know whose question I'm addressing. My right shoulder permanently sits lower, probably from carrying a backpack on one shoulder back in the 90s. I feel this all the time when I'm traveling with a duffel bag on my shoulder. I'm sympathetic. Could be an AC joint issue, but one thing that we have to remember is that we never have an issue just through one plane, right? So it's not just like the scapula does this, it downwardly rotates, right? So we need to get not this to happen, but this to happen. So when we think about that problem, when we think about creating movement through all three planes, one of the discrepancies that you're going to see is trunk rotation, right? So when we're trying to improve trunk rotation, this is a key concept to remember. So say you want to introduce, let's say, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to bench press on tomorrow. It's a Saturday where I'm living. I don't know where you're from, but so tomorrow morning we're gonna wake up, we're gonna go bench, and you say, hey, I got this issue with my shoulders, and I look and I'm like, yeah, yo, it's like lower for sure. Like, all right, let's go to, let's kind of go into our buckets, let's go to our valences. But when I see that type of asymmetry, it's like, all right, I'm going trunk rotation right away, right? I'm not gonna go trunk flexion extension. I'm gonna go trunk rotation. And when I go trunk rotation, the way you rotate the rib cage is different than the way you rotate the lumbar spine. And you have to know the difference. The way that I effectively manipulate the position of my ribs on my thoracic vertebra is by using the muscles that attach to my shoulder blade. This is so key. So what I want you to do when you go in and start pressing, before you start pressing, I want you to do some sort of, whether it's like a book opener laying on the ground. I like the around the world on the wall, where you're in a half kneeling position, where the hip that's how would I describe it? The hip that's furthest to the open hip is furthest from the wall, and you kind of keep a good equidistance, and you kind of go around like this, and then you come back around like this. I did a terrible job, but sue me. When you do that, you need to make sure that one shoulder blade is pushing and the other shoulder blade is pulling. So if I'm here and I want to create trunk rotation, I need to pull this rhomboid in while pushing this serratus out. Or sorry, I don't like the verbiage of that. I want to push this shoulder blade away while pulling this shoulder blade in. So if I'm doing rotation, I have to get my scapula heavily involved. Because if your scapula is not heavily involved, you're just twisting, right? That's so key. I watch people do trunk rotation, and you're not doing trunk rotation. You're doing a lumbar spine rotation. Like if I'm doing some wood chop and I'm just doing this, the actual moment of rotation is happening at my L1T12 vertebra. That's where it's happening. Where it's like, no. I want my ribs to rotate my entire thoracic spine. How you do that is you need to have, this is pushing and this is pulling. Those muscles, when anchored on the shoulder blade, are pulling on the spine or pulling on the ribs, and that's what creates rib cage rotation. Rib cage rotation or trunk rotation is not twisting. It's a push and a pull. So you need to really exaggerate protraction, retraction, upward and downward rotation to create effective movement. So when you go into the bench and when you feel that shoulder blade digging in too much, that one's probably back and this one's probably forward, which probably is a long-term byproduct of that trunk rotation. But the only way you're going to uncoil that isn't by twisting your lumbar spine. It's by pulling your rib cage back using your shoulder blades, right? So using your rhomboids and your serratus. So try that. When you go in tomorrow, and I can't see your name, so I'm sorry, it just says null to host. I'm sure that's not your name, null, like the Uber driver Fanu, which stands for first name unknown, which is such a wild concept that they don't know the name of the guy they're sending to your house with the food you're going to eat. Yeah, I got a bone to pick with Uber. So null, just not your name. Push and pull T-spine rotation, pure T-spine rotation drill before you press next time. Let me know how it goes. Would hyperkyphotic rib cage work in reverse, creating more extension to let the rib cage? Would hyperkyphotic rib cage work in reverse, creating more extension to let scapula move easier? Look, kyphosis is a property of athleticism, right? So hyperkyphotic just means you can't move into extension. But when we see swimmers or you see really good fighters, what I would argue fighters are probably some of the best athletes. Like there's a video versus when it's a press conference of Canelo versus Plant. It was a boxing match last year. I don't know if anyone saw it. Canelo versus Plant in the press conference in the weigh-in where Canelo fucking threw his glasses, Plant threw a punch at him, he ducked it, and then fucking karate chopped him in the neck. Canelo doesn't have a hyperkyphosis. Hyperkyphosis, when you hear that term, it should mean that we don't have an ability to extend. Flexion creates space. So flexion, and what happened, it's so funny, Eric, when you watch the video back, I'll send it to you on YouTube. It's Plant was coming in way too Brody into that situation. And if you've ever been in a fight, whenever you see someone walking in like this, they're extended, right? Like their upper back is extended. This person doesn't have space. They're at the end of the road. They have nowhere to go. And this is what Plant was doing. He's walking in with his chest up like this. Canelo's he's a fighter, probably one of the best of all time. He comes in like a fighter, sternum down, big kyphosis, ton of space, right? So he walks up to him, and then when he goes to throw a punch, Canelo has the ability to extend, misses, fucking karate chops him in the throat, flexes again. But Plant was already here. He had nowhere to go, right? So hyperkyphosis is only negative. I would only assign hyperkyphosis to a person on a diagnosis if they had an inability to extend their spine. The best athletes I know walk in with hyperkyphosis because they have unlimited options because they can move out of it if they need to. Same account, different person, same question. Shoulder pain in resisted internal rotation in range of motion testing appears to incline. Okay. But only appears in incline pressing, overhead pressing exercises under load. Okay. So it's usually an inability for the scapula to set, when you lack that internal rotation. So shoulder pain in resisted internal rotation in range of motion testing, but only appears in incline pressing. Okay. That sounds like it's a capsular issue, right? So that sounds like you have a tight posterior capsule of your shoulder. Chance, I recognize your name, but I can't put a face to you. Feel like you're some sort of clinician or something. So I would chalk that up to that sounds like capsular tightness to me, like posterior all right. Amber with the big flex. I don't even think I could bench 210 pounds, and I have 100 pounds plus of body weight on me. Germany. It's in the morning. Okay, great. That works. Thank you. No. That's definitely not a German name. Considering the rib cage component of all this, very helpful. Cool. I didn't have the piece before. Thank you. Yeah. Sick. Whatever you need. If you ever need anything, let me know. Toronto fucking rights. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. I don't know what you guys. Jacqueline, for sure. Never been in a fight. No one fucks with 6'4", 250-pound guy, dude. Man, to be 6'4", how cool is that? Good for you. Can't train size, they say. Eric, I'll see you on the other side. Guys, that was fun. I appreciate you guys hanging out for the last half hour. Any other questions? I'll literally wait one more minute. Feel free to put any questions in there. Yeah, of course, Adam. Appreciate you hanging out. Eric, we'll see you on the other side. I'll talk to you soon, I'm sure. Yeah, of course. Whatever you guys need. If you need anything, feel free. Reach out. Like, don't hesitate. Schwartz. Yeah, fuck it. Let's wrap. Schwartz, what do we got? If you have someone that walks, always shrug their shoulder up to their ears all the time when they're walking, what is the first thing you're going to look to? Sure. Cervical spine range of motion, right? Cervical spine range of motion and diaphragm. Like that's going to be, if we think of maybe like a house is a good analogy where the diaphragm is the foundation. Now let's use the pelvic floor. This is the roof. Diaphragm is the main floor, and the pelvis is the foundation. If you have something wrong with the roof, I would go down and check the main floor and then check the foundation. So if you have some sort of, it could be scoliosis or something like that, I would check to see, do we have an asymmetry at the diaphragm? Do they have a particular asymmetry in rotation, inability to move through the frontal plane? Do you have some sort of underlying hip issue, or do you have some sort of chronic thing as a neck issue as a byproduct of that? right? If you have a shoulder issue, you have a neck issue. I have really bad shoulder. I sit here and I crack my neck all day as a byproduct of that. If you have a shrug on one side, you could be dealing with an underlying scoliosis that's pushing the ribs on that side to elevate the scapula and have this resting passive shrug. I would work down first, right? Not very often, unless this person has like acute torticollis, is a neck issue going to be directly causing it, but it could be the direct long-term effect of it. So depending on how symptomatic the issue is, if it's asymptomatic, I'm going down. If it's like, oh, fuck, my shoulder's up like this and I can't back out of my driveway and on my back or my wind up of my fucking 4-iron on or whatever the fuck on the third hole, my neck locked up and now I've been walking around like this, like, okay, then I'll think neck up if it's symptomatic. But I would peel that back down into the rib cage and see as you go through the T-spine, is there an underlying scoliosis? If it's functional, something that really helps, I don't know if we discussed this in level 3, but something that really helps with functional scoliosis is spinal flexion, right? So there's literally, it's called the Adams test, where someone might have a scoliosis in their T-spine. And then as they hinge over and they keep their pelvis like square, like put their butt against a wall or something, as they hinge over, you can see an S curve in someone's spine begin to straighten out. Now, that's only if the scoliosis is acquired, not congenital. So we can't go fixing acquired scoliosis. Now, there can be you can't go fixing congenital scoliosis. However, you can improve the exacerbations of a congenital scoliosis that are functional, right? So that I really like Schwartz, this might be useful from an actual application standpoint. I really like the bilateral bent over dumbbell row. And in a case like that, I would put someone's like butt against a wall when they do it. Because if there's like a real asymmetry in the lateral curvature of the spine, there's going to be an asymmetry in the pelvis that if I just have someone like kind of back their butt into a wall when they row and kind of like lean into it as they row, it'll help us standardize as best we can that compensation of that lateral curvature of the spine as it plays out in the pelvis. And that could be something where now you can start to get, it'll feel asymmetrical, sure, but you can start to get some symmetrical like middle trap contraction. And you'll do so in a position where as you hinge over, right, as you get into like a chest parallel to the floor position, a functional scoliosis will start to normalize its position. You'll see the lateral curvature start to move straighter. Now, what you might even see in a congenital scoliosis is you might see that go straighter, but not straight. Because if someone's born with it, they had like Harrington rods, they had to get fitted for braces, these types of things. So a lot of people out there trying to say that they can cure scoliosis. It's like, look, you can cure the stuff that's an exacerbation of a congenital scoliosis that's acquired, like just the way you compensate further exaggerates a natural curve that was there. Sure, we can reduce that, but you can't promise a way that you can get a congenital scoliosis to completely go away. So that's a really good question. Yeah, of course. Yeah, whatever. I'm here for it. You told me about that, Dolman. You're literally at the top of my to-do list. I got your DM. I haven't made it out to Arizona like ever, but I'm going to message you and we'll talk. Work with lots of baseball players, see a lot of work. Guys who tend a lot of contralateral lean to create space, the arm to get forward, lots of arm hike. How do you suggest addressing them more efficiently move through in internal and external rotation? It's a good question. So working with baseball players who tend to get a lot of contralateral lean to create space. So, all right, message me that one on Instagram. I don't know who you are. Again, it's just null. I'm so sorry. I wish I knew your name. Message me that one on IG and we'll dig into that. I'm going to send you some voice notes tomorrow because that one's complicated and I might have some better resources other than me to ask that question. Will Ali comes to mind. He works with Baltimore Orioles. Kyle Rogers, he works with the New York Mets. Taylor Davis works with Push Press. I think that's the name. No, that's not the right name. Where's Taylor Davis? I'm probably not the best person to ask for that. When he competing in power next? Working on it. Crazy knowledge. Thanks again. Yeah, sure. No pain. Just having someone to walk away. No pain. Just have someone just does it when they walk. How does one acquire that? Oh, dude, I don't know, man. That sounds pretty complicated. Just carries, I would just give them some carries and see if that sorts them out. Like if you just give them some loaded carries. Yeah, Logan, for sure. I'll keep an eye out in all corners of my Instagram and we'll chat. Yeah, I don't know, maybe unilateral loaded carries or bilateral loaded carries. That's a weird one to not have like a direct link to it. But yeah, I don't know, Schwartz, send me a video or something and we'll wrap. Somehow we're still about 30 people. Hey, I appreciate you guys hanging out. And for those of you who are watching the recording, if you watched to this point, thanks so much. On that note, I'm oh, there's a whole Q&A thing. You know what? Oh, I see you asked that question there. Asymmetrical muscle weakness, especially on top athletes, is it really more of a neuromuscular inhibition? Often not. Asymmetric muscle weakness, especially in top athletes, they're strong where they need to be. Now, they're strong where they need to be most often. Now, the problem becomes when they don't have variability, they get the asymmetry in their strength is not between left and right. It's between the tissues on the left that are loaded versus the tissues on the left that aren't loaded. Then that's where it's like that becomes the biggest problem, is then creating variability. So we're never trying to completely remove an imbalance from an athlete. It's about creating specific variability for that athlete to be able to have a different option to move through space when they're performing the tasks that they perform most often. This is going to obviously allow them to avoid challenging or avoid getting into positions that they haven't been trained in by training those positions, but also giving them options to maybe take these untrained positions more often in the field of play to help underload the tissues that they tend to have used most often. So like asymmetrical muscle weakness is really, it's not necessarily about symmetry left to right or internal to external or abduction to adduction or flexion to extension, whatever. It's really more about an inability, a lack of awareness of how else they can perform a task, because they find a place where they're positively rewarded for doing it really, really, really good. And they just stick to that all the time. So the gym is about creating options for them to move and creating variability, right? So that's what I want you to focus on with asymmetries in athletes, is just about like, not about novelty. And this is the thing, this is hard. So like, I doubt, oh yeah, you might still be around. You asked the question at 8:54. When people train athletes, you can sit back and watch people do stuff with very minimal principles, and you can watch them and you cannot really understand it. And you can be like, the guy who trains this athlete is dumb. And it's like, I don't know, maybe. But you got to realize that like the good thing about good athletes is you can kind of do whatever, especially if the sport is really skilled and they are a highly skilled athlete. So, but if you want to be better than like, dumb still can win. You just want to win a little bit more often than dumb. Like random is a very good enemy. That's a very worthy opponent. Like think of like the casino, right? The casino, the best odds in casino are like 49-51, just like a single hand of blackjack. I think that's like the true. I don't gamble, but I've been told. But like think of it in sports, like Novak Djokovic wins 53% of points. That doesn't seem like a lot. Best tennis player of all time. Won Wimbledon like, I don't know, 8 times, 9 times, like undefeated for 7 years in a row. But he wins 53% of points. So like when you're dealing with athletes, it's about picking specific variability, not necessarily just doing everything. So it's like there's some asymmetries that you don't even need to address. Like, do I need to improve internal rotation of a pitcher's arm? Probably not. Right? Do I need to improve their rib cage rotation, their plant leg, their plant leg internal rotation, their deceleration properties, their general strength? Yeah, probably. So that's a rabbit hole question, but I doubt, I don't like necessarily using the word inhibition, but I'd be really curious as to what you meant by that. But that's maybe a sidebar question. Oh, where do you start with clients? Okay, so Veronica Phillips asked, bit of a broad question, but where do you start with clients that struggle with vertical pressing? So overhead pressing, I would start them if they struggle with vertical. I would start them at as horizontal a vertical press as they can manage and work up from there. And I would always be terraforming their overhead position with a pull first rather than a push. So let's say, for example, you have someone who struggles with getting into the overhead position. what I would do outside of like the stuff we talked about in the lecture, I would go, let's start with like a floor press, horizontal dumbbell floor press. You get a ton of external reference, a ton of stability, and you're just pushing horizontally. How does that? Oh, it feels pretty good. Okay, good. You're going to do a single arm cable row that's like at 120 degrees. How's that feel? Yeah, pretty good. Okay, you're going to do a high cable bicep curl that's at 120 degrees. How's that feel? Pretty good. Okay. You're going to do a overhead cable tricep extension at 145 degrees. How's that feel? Ah, my shoulder feels a little tight. Okay. So we're going to keep here, and I'm going to like cue you as the cable pulls kind of in this 145 degree. And as we do a couple of weeks of triceps here, I'm going to cue you to like, hey, as you're coming down into this lengthened position, drive your elbow up towards the sky and let your forearm kind of crunch your bicep. And then over time, you go from 145 degrees of elbow extension, or sorry, of shoulder abduction to like 150, 160. And then you go from like a single arm lat pull down or a row from 120 to like 130, and you go from pressing on a floor to a flat bench to 15 degrees to 30 degrees. And then you slowly just start terraforming the overhead position with high cable bicep curls, overhead tricep extensions, maybe some exaggerated lateral raise. Maybe you work in some light carries at the point where they can do a tricep extension in a full 180 degree shoulder abduction. Then you press it a 45, a 60, and then a 60 or 70 degrees, and then to a 90 or 75, 90 degrees. So it's not about just vertical pressing. It's just the shape of that exercise. And how can we start to incrementally train some of the ancillary muscles that will be assisting in that position? It's a funny question to ask. I tell the story all the time. First client I ever had, I just had him do my workouts. And the first work exercise I did in my workout was overhead dumbbell press. And as I gave this person the workout that I did, and they did like their third rep, or on the fourth rep, they hit themselves in the head. And then a few weeks later, I had them do an overhead, or I tried to have them do an overhead dumbbell tricep extension, and they were doing this. I'm like, oh, they can't even get in the overhead position to use their tricep. I was asking them to use way more weight and their delts and their tricep in this same position 3 weeks ago. No wonder they hit themselves in the head, right? So I would just look at the shape of it, reverse engineer it, and think about all of your accessory movements, your single joint exercises, or your more simple exercises like your bicep, your tricep extension, your lateral raises, your pulls, and then I would have your pressing be the last thing to sort of enter the chat, if you will. So hopefully that helps. Schwartz, I got your question. Great. Yeah, still here. Thanks for answering my question. Asymmetrical muscle weakness. My question came from, oh, great. Okay, sick. Let's wrap. Okay, so Amber asked one. Okay, so I'm going to get this one in here. Thanks for answering my question, asymmetrical muscle. My question came from more resistance muscle testing assessment approach. I found that there's a common denominator between top athletes, couch potatoes, and everything in between. That common denominator is consistent muscle pattern of weakness when underperformed in a resistance muscle assessment with all level of athletes with lack of. Yeah. So I have to be honest, I don't do much muscle testing with my top athletes. I really just dig into the tasks they need to perform, the muscles they use to perform it, and what are the things that can help create deliberate variability so that they know how to underload into certain positions. So like some guys are very knee dominant, some guys are very hip dominant. Hip dominant guys in the gym, I'm going to make them do more knee dominant things. Why? Because one, they're already using their hips too much and it lets them recover. And then two, if they're ever in a position where they need to use their knees, well, we have them able to use their knees at least at higher levels of endurance, intensity, or velocity. And then whether or not they can put that together with rhythm, coordination, and timing on the field is kind of another question. So I don't know much about individualized muscle testing and how accurately that stuff carries over. I don't know if it's table testing. I don't know how well we can use that as an accurate read of the nervous system, because I think a lot of things really change when we start loading people. So for example, like one that we see all the time is I can take a guy and put his kneecap to his nose on a table, but then I ask him to do a single leg hinge and he can't flex his trunk more than 30, 40 degrees without feeling like his Achilles is going to rip off the bone. So it's like, how much are we getting a true representation of this nervous system's act or resting state when we're not having to manage the forces of gravity, and more importantly, manage our center of mass. right? And when we're doing unloaded table testing, is it transferable to when we actually get them and doing the test? Like the thing that I like the player that we had that played for Georgia that played on the Packers, he couldn't figure out lunging because but when he ran like a gazelle. It's like some people are just so task oriented that the state of the nervous system when they're performing the task becomes a prerequisite to them performing the task. So I wouldn't use any other data other than the thing that's closest to the training stimulus that they're used to derive whether or not a muscle is working or not. I don't think you can safely say that, oh, just because it works in this isolated setting or doesn't work in this isolated setting. Well, maybe it requires the dynamic stability of, maybe it requires what is, maybe it requires the dynamic stability that's present when they're actually performing the task for that muscle to work. Maybe they need to pull themselves into a position first with another muscle to get. So I'm a little bit weary of table testing across the board. And in my career, I find myself doing less and less of it. Not that I say it's not useful. I would just need to get into muscle testing a little bit more. Okay, I got some rib pain when doing compression strength, like pressing handstands. Do you get any idea how to address this? It depends. Rib pain can be an intercostal thing. It can be an oblique thing. It can be a serratus thing. It would be really dependent on what accessory. So if it's handstand, I probably think serratus, unless you're in some sort of hyperextended anteriorly tilted position, which if you do have enough of them, then it might be oblique. A good way to test whether it's oblique or serratus is like laterally flex to one side and rotate to the opposite side, like crunch and then laterally flex. If you get pain doing that on the involved side, it's probably oblique. I would just avoid irritating it as best you can in the early stages and then go through some sort of progression of passive mobilization, active assisted, active resisted. Ribs are tough that way because they're always moving because we're always breathing, or we hope we're always breathing. But yeah, I would need a little bit more context. Not my concern. My thought is it will probably be oblique related, which increasing trunk rotation, increasing lateral expansion will help. But yeah, there's some nuance to that. Okay, so last question, Amber Watson. Hyperkyphosis came up earlier in a different context, but if you had an older geriatric client patient with true hyperkyphosis and accompanying instability to get you into the overhead position. Yeah, you're in rights. Sweet, glad to hear. Talk to you soon. And accompanying inability to get in the overhead position, where would you start to help them improve? Okay, so hyperkyphosis. Okay, so this might be too simple of an answer, but I'll give like my knee-jerk reaction first. Is I wouldn't worry about it. I would worry about getting her stronger. So I would put her in an environment as often as she could recover from and tolerate. How do we know? It's like, well, she continues to get stronger. If she continues to get stronger, then we know that when she stops getting stronger, we know that she's overtrained. But I think in this case, something like a chest supported row can be super useful. There are a ton of neurological implications to a lack of range of motion and instability when it comes to the elderly. And it's a fairly complex subtopic, but that leads to, again, very simple interventions when it comes to training. So when we deal with geriatrics, you're really dealing, and I hate to use the word because it sounds so dumb, but like a lot of your driving decision-making factors are all your driving forces around how you factor in your decision making. It's kind of based off of the central nervous system, and you should be having the thought, no shit, it's all based off the central nervous system. But when we deal with balance and we deal with stability, these two things are fundamentally different in where we're addressing them. So balance is an input from our eyes and our vestibular cerebellar system, right? Or our vestibular apparatus, as so far as those two structures interact with one another to create balance. Stability is an input from our proprioceptors, right? And joint capsules, muscle spindles, and Golgi tendon organs, which are part of our spinocerebellar tract. So when we deal with elderly clients, one, we need to recognize we're dealing with someone who's weaker than the forces of gravity acting on them. So there's a ton of compensations that are going to happen just as a byproduct of that likely are the outermost layers of compensation. So if I'm dealing with a hyperkyphosis, I'm probably dealing with someone who just has general weakness everywhere. So I'm going to put them in the position in every exercise I choose, for the most part, and I'll explain the caveat in a second, to be loaded as much as they can possibly be loaded in that position, right? And then they won't be able to tolerate much volume. They won't be able to tolerate much load. And then when they can't do that, I'm going to have them do things that are really, really underloaded, that are high in sensory input. So like for us, you know, I'm assuming that I can do exercises that are high in sensory input and do them in high output, right? That's like what a well-balanced neuromuscular system can do, right? I can do a bunch of pull-ups, and I can throw something, and I can do a bunch of deadlifts, and I can do a bunch of lunges, and I can hold stuff in one hand, whatever. Each one of those tasks has a high sensory input demand while also having a high motor output demand. Right. And as a decent athlete, I can do those things. And that's what makes a good athlete, is they can process sensory information really quick and translate it into motor output. They're sensory motor savants, is how I like to refer to athletes. So you can throw high sensory input and high motor output tasks at them, and they can respond. When you deal with geriatrics, it's almost like you, in the early stages, have to break those two things almost separately apart. Like you have to break them apart entirely as best you can. And obviously you can't. You're always getting sensory input. But I would subdivide tasks from externally stabilized, very loadable, to help just build overall strength. And then I would put them in deliberately underloaded, externally unstable positions to drive as much sensory input as possible. I'm not saying like put them on Bosu balls and shit like that, you know, but if you get this person to stand on one leg or do a single leg RDL with a ton of support, it's not going to really be meaningfully loading the glute or the hip or the hamstring or adductor or whatever, but it's going to be loading like, oh, now you have a head position that's perpendicular to the floor that probably hasn't been in like 20 or 30 years, right? Like if you don't think how little these people can hinge over. So getting them in positions where they're, you know, their head is a different position. I'm going to single leg RDL, hold on to a bench, look towards me, look the other way. And it's like, I don't really care. I'm not trying to load the hamstring. I'm really just trying to get as much sensory input in this position as possible. Can they turn the lights on inside their brain to know where their body is in space in a position that will compromise them if they don't? Lunges, falling up and down stairs is like, that's what, careful. When you're over the age of 55, you fall and crack a hip. Think between cracking a hip and cracking a rib, 50% of people are dead within a year. So when you suffer from a cardiac event, if you crack a rib, you can't get a full breath in and out, you end up with pneumonia. 50% of people dead. When you fracture a hip, you end up, what's the hip? I think it's a cardiac event too. You break a hip, and then within 50% of people who break a hip over the age of like 55, 65 are dead within a year. So I'm going to do some sort of underloaded lunge variation. Like I'll have people do split squats with bands underneath their armpits attached to the top of the rack. And it's not about motor output. It's about sensory input. So when you deal with geriatric patients, I find it's best to subdivide their training into high motor output, which is still going to be meaningful sensory input. If you think about it, when they lift heavy weights, what's telling them they lift heavy weights? Well, that's an input. And the heavier the weight they can lift, the more inputs they can manage. And it's actually part of the cycle that helps them get more stable, is getting stronger first. But what a lot of people do with old people is they go, oh, they're unstable, let's just make them more unstable. It's like, no, they're already unstable. Like, what the fuck? Dude, stop doing that. It's so dumb. Get them stronger, they'll become more stable. It'll allow you to push stability as a separate stimulus, and then you can get stronger. And then, you know, it's always a question of, when does motor output drive sensory input to then drive motor output? Where it's double dutch, when do we get in? For most people who are intermediate lifters, sensory input drives motor output. People who are old and geriatric and maybe severely deconditioned, I think it's motor output that gives us an easy window into sensory input, which allows us to then train sensory input. Because of that motor output gets us stronger, we can start to train more of these high sensory input exercises, which then starts the snowball effect of being able to be stronger and more stable and more mobile. So did we do it? We did it. There's still 32 of you left. Yo, shout out for just hanging out with me on a Friday night. So huge thanks to, I literally am looking at a list of people just called Null and Null. So thanks to Null, and everyone else. Yes, appreciate it, dude, girl, dude, all your friends out there. Everyone's just Null. So I'm going to jet for the night. If you guys need anything, honestly though, like, reach out, Jordan at themuscledoc.com or Instagram, whatever. Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you guys hanging. Great questions. Hopefully you guys took something away. If you need anything again for the last time, reach out. Yeah, we'll see you guys when I see you.